All right, well, time to start our meeting.
Woohoo! What is he doing?
Nice.
What's he doing?
So since I couldn't be there in person, I at least had to, as we're about to usher in a new college football season, had to wear my colors. So someday I'm going to go up there and have watch a game with Richard Barnett and Cameron Deal. Does that sound good? Anyone else?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Mendenhall, you're welcome.
Not
you.
Yeah, I was talking to the other Mendenhall.
That's it.
If you want to watch the game, fine, but come tailgate with me.
All right. Well, I'll keep this close to my heart, but so you're not too distracted, I'll take it off for now. So welcome everyone to our meeting. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm on gallbladder attack watch for my wife today, and didn't feel like I could leave town when she was fighting an attack. So it's possible she may be having to have her gallbladder removed later today or tomorrow. So anyway, I've been given permission to be here by my wife because she's doing okay this morning. So anyway, welcome everyone. I see we've got a number of people on the phone. It looks like, let's see. Did I see Mayor Miley Wilson Edwards? You called in, right? Jewel Allen.
Yes, I'm on.
Mayor Bierman. Let's see, Mayor Ramsey. Mayor Niehaus, right? There she is. Who else is on the phone or Zoom?
Roger's on the phone.
Roger is.
Yes.
And someone else on the phone.
Jewel.
I think we've got them. That was the list that I.
That was it. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Appreciate those of you that could be there in person, and again, appreciate the opportunity to be able to do this digitally, and that's why we set it up this way. Cameron pointed out to me because there are going to be times when all of us have to do this remotely. So, any housekeeping, Cameron, that we need to hit right now?
Yeah, in fact, it's actually the definition of housekeeping. Since the last time we met, we have invested in improved microphones and sound panels on the wall. So hopefully between those two things, the echo goes down dramatically for those of you on the call. We wanted to make sure that it actually did function the way we envisioned it to function. So it was, hopefully it'll be an investment, a worthwhile investment.
I can see the panels. It looks good, and most importantly, it sounds good. So thank you, Cameron.
It sounds really good.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, well, let's go ahead if we can and start with the minutes. We have minutes from April 24th, as well as May 3rd and June 18th. Is there anyone that would make a motion, or if there are any corrections that need to be made to those minutes, if you'd make those suggestions now?
I have a suggestion for corrections on the April 24th.
Everyone, can you hear Jewel?
No.
No.
Jewel, I'm not hearing you well either.
Okay.
Can you turn up your volume or?
See. Can you hear me better?
Yes.
Better.
Okay. So just a few corrections. On the first page, my first name is just one L.
Yes. That's
I
from.
know.
You correct that?
I just thought I'd mention that. And then on page 2, under Get Healthy, there was a question mark at the end of the sentence is West Valley and question mark. Is that information you can supply in the minutes?
Nick, could you hear that?
No, I'm sorry, Jewel. We're not. You're breaking up a little bit as you go. And would you maybe want to type that into the chat, and I can
Okay.
Yeah, if you would type any corrections, do you have any others, Jewel?
Just another one on 2018 to 2019 priorities. A typo there, but I will type the correction that I had for page 2. So it says West Valley and question mark.
Does
Do you
anyone
see
else
that on page 2?
Yes.
Do you see that?
Yep.
Does anyone else have any corrections? If not, what I'd suggest is a motion to approve the minutes subject to those things that Jewel has mentioned, and we'll put in writing to Nick.
So moved.
We have a motion. Was that you, Mike? Okay. Do we have a second?
Nicole Martin with the second.
Thank you, Nicole. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously to approve all 3 meeting minutes. All right. Next one, any conflicts of interest that anyone has as you look over the agenda today? Seeing or hearing none, we'll move on to the board commission reports and appointments. Abby?
Mayor, can we skip to number 5? Abby had to step out to grab something, and so can we?
Absolutely. Let's go to the National League update, Cameron.
Perfect. And then Nick, Brett Graham just texted me having difficulty getting into Zoom. So can you send him the link? Yes. Perfect.
Thank you.
Perfect. Back in the spring, this board approved the highest amount of dollars for a professional development budget that, frankly, I've seen in my time at the league. So I wanted to let you know we're already putting it to good use. Half of the staff was at the National League of Cities staff retreat last month, where they met, and there was Nick, Abby, Susan, and Carson met with their colleagues from state leagues. About 40 state leagues were there in Denver, talking about everything from conference planning to communication plans and other things. I met last week with state league directors from more than 40 leagues around the country at the annual retreat. One thing that came out of that meeting, I have 3 takeaways, and there's one thing I need to inform you about. I was elected to the NLC Board of Directors last week on behalf of the league directors. I told them I was not going to officially accept until I'd had a chance to come back to this board to confirm that. If you do confirm it, it'll be the first time the league director's been on the NLC board in recent memory, and the first Utah person on the NLC board in several years since Mayor Becker was on the board. So part of the reason that I was nominated to be on the NLC board is the fall NLC conference is going to be in Salt Lake City in 2 years, and it would be a 2-year term. So it would be an opportunity to help as they prepare for that conference, which draws 4,000 plus people here. Second, NLC is working on their presidential platform, which dovetails into the discussions we've been having about how to engage in the 2020 election here. And so I was asked to serve on that platform committee on behalf of the league directors. And then the third reason that is really appealing to me is access to the NLC corporate partners, and hopefully be able to find additional revenue streams for our league here so that we can better meet the needs of our members. So I have 3 takeaways from all the meetings that we've had with NLC, but I wanted to start with that nomination for me to serve on the NLC Board of Directors for 2 years. So Mayor Pike, I'll turn it back to you before I go to the takeaways.
How do you feel of that, members of the board? I mean, I think that's fantastic, and I'd be thrilled to have Cameron be able to accept that. How do you feel?
It's a terrible idea. Just kidding. Just kidding.
I was on the board the last time when Mayor Becker was president of the NLC, and I'm excited. I think it's a great opportunity.
I'm always wanting more NLC in just the conversations we have, the conversations I have with the city. They have some great tools and some policy programs, trainings for elected leaders that I haven't seen anywhere else. So I think that's wonderful. Any way we can better integrate and interface with the NLC is excellent. So I'm supportive of that.
It's an even better way for us to keep in touch with what's going on nationally. I think it's great that you got the opportunity.
So while it's not necessary, I'd love to symbolically entertain a motion to the effect of allowing Cameron to serve on the National League board.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, Nick, do you have who made those or somebody?
I do.
Okay, any discussion on the motion? All in
Just that I
favor?
think it's fantastic. I think it's great. Thank you, Cameron, for your willingness to serve.
Thank you, Mayor Ramsey. Any other comments? All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you and congratulations, Cameron. That's a great opportunity and honor.
Well, thank you. I think it speaks highly of the work we're doing here in Utah and speaks highly to the work we're doing at a league that we are on the radar of other state leagues and the NLC leadership. And let me give you just a couple of examples of the takeaways I had from last meeting. One, we have one of the smallest league staffs in the country, but we punch above our weight, not just locally, but nationally. So let me give you three brief examples of how work we are doing here is resonating in other states around the country. First, on housing policy. Last year, Rachel led our efforts in what became SB 34, and I had multiple state league directors asking me last week, what did the Utah League do? What recommendations do you have for us? And the whole reason the National League of Cities research arm is focused on housing was because of us pushing it. And we were doing interviews with NLC research staff while we were negotiating SB 34 here locally. So, Rachel's efforts here locally have resulted in the first ever affordable housing task force at the NLC level. And they're planning on a 5-year research effort around housing that I think will be very helpful to us. So that, Rachel's work here with our small staff in a flyover state is having positive repercussions around the country. Second, Carson, our research analyst, has been collecting model ordinances and bills from ALEC. ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council that has been pushing preemptive legislation in state houses around the country. I shared with the NLC leadership the work that Carson has been doing for us. It's just a one-man band here. And the NLC leadership liked it so much, they are going to take that model and build a database of not just the bills, but of strategies that state leagues are using around the country to push back, so we can exchange these best practices amongst ourselves. And I led a discussion about that Friday morning with the fellow league directors. So that NLC effort started with Carson's work here. And then third, you all saw the communication effort during the legislative session where we're trying to highlight the good things that cities were doing. Florida did a very similar effort. They have a staff of 220. They have 8 full-time communication people. Susan has a shop of one. Where's Susan at? In here yet? Okay. She has a staff of 1.5.
She's in the staff meeting.
And yet when Florida outlined everything they did during the session, I was able to get up in my presentation and say, yeah, we basically did all of that with a staff of 1.5. And other leagues wanted to know how we were trying to change the narrative around our legislative team and combining legislation and communication. So anyway, we don't have an insurance pool. We're one of the smallest staffs in the country, but the work we're doing here is resonating elsewhere. So that's what Councilmember Mendenhall, hopefully Mayor Mendenhall, I appreciate your comments about us tapping into NLC resources, but I think the NLC has a lot they can learn from us too. So that one takeaway is we punch above our weight.
Hey, just don't leave us for national.
Yeah, no thanks.
Nobody
No,
gets
thanks.
to see Utah.
It's in the contract.
You didn't see that in the contract, did you?
It's an agenda.
The second key takeaway is a reminder that we're at a really great crossroads of the organization right now to complete the reboot of the league. So I've been the director now for almost 2 years, if you can believe that. Beth, can you believe that, by the way? Right, where's Mayor Hyatt right now, or former Mayor Hyatt?
Oh my goodness, the stress level is so much lower now.
In the coming year, we're moving the annual convention also to open up tremendous revenue opportunities, but also program opportunities. We're going through the reboot of the website, and our tentative timing for that is to reboot the website publicly at the conference in September, so a year from now. going to take them about that long to do it anyway. So those are the two big public faces of the organization. Messaging opportunities. We've got a lot of great individual messages that we can focus on bringing it all together. And we had an interesting discussion last week that I want to prep you for now that we'll come back to in future board meetings. Multiple leagues have undergone an external value study of what the value is of the brand of the league. And then they've used that to try to set their prices for exhibitors and sponsors. And to a league, they all said, we realized we were undervaluing ourselves to the private sector, and they were able to increase sponsorship revenue and exhibit revenue, which then they could plug back into programming. I'm going to be following up with several league directors on how they've done this. In Florida's case, it's taken over 2 years. In North Carolina's case, it's taken almost 5. But they've been going through this full reboot, similar to what we're doing here. And it's, in the case of North Carolina, they were able to increase their staff from 70 to 97 over the course of that 5 years because of the additional revenue they were able to bring in. Now they have a trust, we don't. So the scale will be different. But I think there's a tremendous opportunity here over the next few months for this board and for staff to use the Salt House and the website to finish the reboot. And lots of other leagues are going through it right now that we can lean on. And then the third key takeaway, and we spent 2 hours as directors talking about this piece, is focusing on the why we do what we do instead of just what we do. And the why piece really resonated with me because over the last few months, as I've done performance evaluations with our membership, or excuse me, with our staff, we've been having this discussion about how do we better prioritize what we do, especially with such a small staff. We have 8 full-time staffers, and then a few people work with us on a contract basis. That's not a lot of bandwidth when you look at everything that we have our fingers in. So figuring out how to better prioritize and focus on the why we do what we do rather than just the what we do, aligning our brand and logo and messaging. Also looking at the relationship we have with affiliate organizations. So there are many leagues that have relationships with their attorneys or their managers or their business license professionals or their clerks that is different in how we handle it. Some actually charge those groups for lobbying or charge those groups for programming. Some have them sit on the board like we do with Gary being here on behalf of the UCMA, and the UCMA elects him to serve on this board. And other leagues that face conflicts like we did last year, where one affiliate group, in our case the police chiefs and law enforcement, were pushing one agenda that was contrary to the stated position of the league. So it was an in-depth conversation of like, how do leagues handle this? And again, getting that focus of why we do what we do. So I don't bring it up to focus the conversation today on it, but to set the stage for future conversations and upcoming board meetings as we continue to figure out how to take the league to the next level and meet the needs of our memberships on legislative advocacy and on training, because those are really the 2 things that people most expect from us. Also, a ton of other ideas for value adds to the members that other leagues are doing that are worthy of discussion, again, within the limited bandwidth. So we had discussions ranging from how to engage the new generation of elected officials, the under 40 crowd and what they're looking for. Not even say, it's not even about the age, it's more about just new elected officials. Like they want to be able to get elected and hit the ground running and not have to sit on committees and wait their time like the older generation did. So how do you engage a newer generation of elected officials? What sort of annual reports can leagues do to be relevant? There was a lengthy discussion on gun violence and what's the role of city leaders talking about gun violence. So it was a very insightful 4 days of discussion with more than 40 league directors. And so I wanted to report that back to you, see if you had any questions or thoughts on that piece, and also just thank you for making the financial dedication in this budget to allow me as well as staff members to engage with the other leagues around the country.
Thank you, Cameron. Any questions on that report for Cameron?
I don't have a question, but I just have a comment, Mayor. This is Beth Holbrook. One of the things that I'm working on with APTA, which is the public transportation at the association, back in DC in March, we met actually with the NLC, and I'm suggesting that we engage with them on a better level than what has been done in the past for transit. because obviously those are, I think, very well connected. And so I'm going to be put on their TOD committee nationwide for APTA so that I can help understand all the housing stuff a little bit better and kind of with that focus on transit. But I just think that this is a great opportunity because there is a lot of interconnectedness that I'm seeing that I think you're just increasing, you know, tenfold. So just wanted to.
Well, thank you, Beth. And my staff will cringe when I say this, but I have 80 typewritten pages of notes from my meetings with other league directors. No, 80. I'm very proud of those notes. We're not going to go through all of them word for word, but we'll have some good strategic discussions as staff. And then Mayor Pike and future President Mendenhall, I think it would be a worthy effort after the new board comes in September to spend maybe the first board meeting this fall having a strategic discussion about the legislature and our priorities. We can go into that in more detail later in the agenda, but I'll give me chance to go through the notes, sit down with staff, and come back with some potential recommendations for consideration.
Sounds good, Cameron.
You don't want 80 pages of notes?
Should we go back to number 4 with Abby?
Yep, Abby, we skipped number 4 because I went to number 5. So will you give the quick update?
Okay. So just an update from last time on our boards and commissions. There should be 5 in your packet. We have 4 appointments we'd like to recommend. For the Records Management Committee, I spoke with she's here right now. So she's president of the Municipal Clerks Association, and she recommended Nancy Dean of Clearfield, and she spoke with her fellow board members, and they all agreed that they would like to send Nancy Dean through. We also received an application from Tracy Hansen. She's the city recorder of Ogden. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with her, but we would like to go forward with Nancy Dean. Second board is the Public Land Policy Advisory Board. They are very eager to get someone onto that board. Their first meeting is August 19th, which is a week from today. We've received 1 application from Dave Milheim, who's the retired city manager at Farmington. So we would like to put him forward just because we're on such a tight timeline. The third one is going to be the Rural Online Working Hubs Grant. That one we've received 2 applications, one from Haven Dunn as well as the Mayor of Boulder, Stephen Cox. So we'd like to go ahead with Stephen Cox for that position. The last 2 we don't have any recommendations for, but for the private activity bond, they're getting a little bit eager as well. We have about 4 recommendations we received from Wayne Parker of Provo. So we're going to reach out to those 4 people and see if anyone's interested. And then if we decide from one of those people, we're just going to send it to the board officers so we don't have to wait for the next board meeting. And then the last one is the Utility Facility Review Board, and we are still soliciting applications for that. And that's our update. And then from last time, we actually sent Craig Humphreys to the mental health protections for first responders, and then the Dustin Gettle and Amy Anderson to Utah Commission on Aging.
Any questions for Abby on those board members? If not, I'd entertain a motion that do we have any questions? Sorry, did I hear something? Emily, Mayor Niehaus?
I do have a question. I just, I was curious about Dave Milheim's position on public land policy.
Yes, so I do have, he sent over his statement of interest, and he did attach, he has pretty lengthy resume. I can go through and just list some of his experience on there that might qualify him for that board. That help you out?
And what's interesting about Dave, Mayor Niehaus, is that he was the city manager in Farmington, and he's done a lot of work dealing with the Forest Service, and so he has He has some experience dealing with public lands issues and the interface along the Wasatch Front. Also well respected within the City Management Association. Seeing that he's retired, we thought that was a good way to engage someone who's not working for a specific city right now, so we can look broadly for all communities, but still tap into that expertise. He's also previously worked in South Jordan City and worked in the private sector as well.
I guess my question is his position to protect public lands or keep them federally designated? Like, that's a conversation we've been having down in Moab, so I'm just curious what his stance is on public land policy in general.
We did not ask him that because the request was about the representative of municipalities to be part of the advisory committee. If the board wanted us to pursue additional questions of him before we submit his name to the governor, we could do so. We were recognizing there are going to be city leaders on all sides of that issue. That's why we were looking for any applicant who had a broad experience working with a variety of different cities and who would be well known within the overall organization. But if the board wants to hold off on promoting his name and ask some follow-up questions, we could do that, or we could proceed with Dave Milheim for the spot.
Could you just forward me his response and his application, and then I could just reach out to him? I would feel comfortable with that.
Yeah, I can
Yep.
email that over to you.
We'll email it to the whole board.
Yeah,
just
we'll
so
send
you
it to
have.
the board. And then we can go over that. The other thing, I was working with Chloe Nixon. She's the one that's kind of pushing to get someone on that board. She did say if we can't get anyone, she would like either a board member or staff member to attend, just so we can kind of see what they're going to be talking about, and so we can see if there's anyone who might think is qualified. So.
And to piggyback what Abby just said, Abby's taken on this task, and it's a thankless but important one. We appoint over 40 individuals to state boards and commissions, including several people who are on our board right now, represent the league at large on these different boards and commissions. So we've been trying to, one, make sure we have the best and brightest who are able to serve in these capacities, but two, make sure there's two-way dialogue back to the league board when appropriate, so that if Dave Milheim is the representative on this committee, it's not Dave speaking for Dave, it's Dave having two-way dialogue back with the board and then speaking on behalf of the board in that advisory committee. Again, there are close to 40 boards and commissions, and so we're still trying to figure out a better process for that two-way dialogue, but that's certainly our intent.
Well, that's an important distinction to make with any of these groups, that no one person's ideology is pushing the actions of that group, but in fact, it's meant to spur discussion and dialogue. So I think it's just an important blanket statement to be made, because that's not the only board that's going to generate some controversy depending on who's looking at it through what lens.
Correct. And a perfect example is Cindy Mansell, who's the Salt Lake City recorder, represents the league on the State Records Committee. And now the State Records Committee is a little different than the Records Management Committee, which Abby just presented, because they're splitting the two in half. So Cindy will continue to represent us on the State Records Committee. She sends us a monthly email with a recap of what was before the State Records Committee, and then we as staff review it. If there's something that we feel like needs board follow-up, like we did in St. George in the April meeting, and we brought that forward to the board. If it's just a check-in, then we leave it at the staff level. On the towing advisory board over the last couple of years, we had a city attorney, Brian Jones from Provo, and Mark Stratford from Ogden, who represented the league. And I was on a regular call with both of them, getting feedback of what was being discussed at the towing advisory board. And then we didn't bring that back to the board. We brought it actually back to LPC. And so both of them did a presentation last fall in the LPC saying, here's what we came to consensus on. So we're trying to figure out the best process for each of these boards and commissions. And thus far, the people who have expressed a willingness to serve all have expressed that willingness with the understanding that they are accountable back to the league, whether that's the board or delegated to the LPC or to staff, depending on the board.
So Andy Behrman from Park City here. I just wanted to weigh in. I've gotten to know Dave, and I think he'll be a good representative on this board. but I do think it's important we have a conversation with him that the board doesn't really have a public lands policy at this point. So he's there to listen and bring back information, not take a particular stand.
I appreciate that comment, Mayor. And I think, you know, I don't know that we want to get into too much of a litmus test on these positions, but those of you that know these people or of them or who's nominated them, I think, you know, those things are important. So we at least know their willingness to work and to communicate. You know, Cameron, you know Dave Milheim, I think, well, and maybe there are others in the room that do. Is there any concern that you have or any of you have based on what your knowledge of him as a city manager has been?
I'll also ask Gary Hill to jump in and answer that, as well as the UCMA rep. I've had the good fortune of knowing Dave basically my whole professional career. I've known him professionally and then actually personally. He was a longtime neighbor of my in-laws. Dave is very forthright. He listens, and then he's a very aggressive advocate. And so he will be willing he'll be willing to say the things that need to be said. And I think he will do as the board asks. The nice thing about Dave is his mayor is on our board. Or I should back up, his former mayor, since he's no longer employed in Farmington City, but his former mayor is on the league board currently. And Dave has always had a very strong collaborative working relationship with the league. Gary, is there anything you want to add?
I agree completely. With that, I might make a motion then that we appoint Nancy Dean, Dave Milheim, and Mayor Cox as listed in the staff packet.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Was that Gary Hill made the motion?
It was.
And who made the second?
Nicole Martin.
Thanks, Nicole. Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, seeing none, all in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? That motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Thank you, Abby. Okay, now let's see if I have this right. We're on number 6, which is the Mayor Brent and Jenny Taylor Service Award that we've discussed in previous meetings. We've received, let's see, Cameron, did you tell me 14 nominations?
Correct.
And staff and executive committee have settled on one. And this person would be Steve Fairbanks from Sandy City. Nicole Martin, I believe, nominated him. Is that correct, Nicole?
That is correct, yes.
Would you just, you know, and again, we don't maybe need a motion on this, but I'd like to symbolically anyway. But Nicole, would you just speak to why you believe Steve is deserving of this? I think many of us know Steve, but I'd love to have your thoughts before I ask for a motion.
Okay, so I'll say this. I think we all have a genuine love of Brent. And so when you come up with a nominee for an award of such distinction that bears Brent's name, one of the things that I would liken to both of these amazing individuals is just their passion for government. So that's how I'll start off my nomination for Steve Fairbanks. Is he truly, truly loves local government, and frankly has devoted more years than I can count accurately in the service of that government at all different levels. Does it happily, never grumbles, brings amazing institutional knowledge to every role that he, that he's offered. And as I reached out to him to get a little bit of background, he's never turned down an assignment. How many of us could say that? He's been given many. For those of you who know Steve, he has served on so many boards and commissions, and often when his health was such that he should not serve, he has still done that. So with this particular award, as I said, bearing the name of Brent, I think it's nice to honor those who are doing government the way we all truly hope government is done. And that's with a love of those they serve and a passion for doing the right thing at the right time, even when it's challenging. And he is all of those things.
Well said, Nicole. And again, emphasis on a long history of those commitments and many service opportunities. So I believe he's a past president of this board. Is that right, Cameron?
Right. 2 times. Perpetual office.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so he's never not been serving on.
Is anyone have any concerns or comments otherwise?
You know, can I just say, I received a call from the mayor of Tooele that Steve was vacating his position as president. He performed on stage the most incredible impersonation of Louis Armstrong. What a wonderful world. Mayor, you'd have to have been there to appreciate this. Nicole nailed it. You just can't find a greater person, more dedicated person than Steve to this effort. Just a wonderful person. Nicole, that was a great tribute to you.
You might know him a little bit too, John, huh?
Yeah, you bet. I think we have some tales back to Highland High School, but we won't say how those went. You know, we both grew up, I hope. But no, Steve he's been tremendous. And even before his service here on the council, he was the chairman of various committees in Sandy City, as Nicole pointed out.
Sorry to interrupt you. I need the cars moved by these trees right here. The Susan, your car, and all these guys. Okay, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. Anyway, Mayor, I just applaud this. He's a wonderful person.
Thank you. Well, if there are no other comments or concerns, again, lots of wonderful people nominated. And I think Steve's really long tenure and long-standing commitment of service, and I think kind of set him apart a little bit, and right along the lines of the things Nicole was saying, I think this would be well received by all of the membership. I'd entertain a motion if you're so inclined to name him as receiving the first Mayor Brent and Jenny Taylor Service Award.
Well, I would like to make that motion. Is that an okay motion for you to make where I nominated?
Yep.
So moved. I would put forward the nomination of Steve Fairbanks to be the first ever recipient of the Mayor Brent and Jenny Taylor Service Award.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion by Nicole, and who made the second?
Mayor Arvey.
Thank you, Mayor Arvey. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? That motion passes unanimously. Thank you, everyone, and thanks to the staff for going through all the work to make this happen. I think this will be a poignant and really nice tribute. And so now the staff will let Jenny know, as I understand it, correct, Cameron? And we'll have her hopefully there to help us present this award.
Correct, and we'll let Steve know. He doesn't know, so we'll follow up with him to make sure he'll be at the annual convention when we make the presentation to him. Mayor, do you want to reference what the actual gift will be from the league?
Why don't you go ahead, Cameron?
Well, I want to thank Wayne Bradshaw. We were strategizing of like what would be a meaningful gift that reflected service to our communities and to our state. And Wayne recommended purchasing a state flag that has flown over the Capitol, and then we can get a nice case for it and then have something signed by the officers. And so that's what we're going to do. We'll do that presentation during the annual convention.
Sound good, everybody?
Yeah, along with our Stanley Cup plaque.
We also wanted to make sure that the recognition continued over time. And so we'll have a plaque here at the office where we'll keep track of Taylor Award winners going forward. And I should piggyback on that another task I've asked of Abby has been to look through all of our past presidents and invite them back to the President's Banquet the final night of the annual convention. Because it gets back to the idea that just because you retire from public service doesn't mean that you that your time of contributing to the community is over. And so we'd like to make sure that even when your time as mayor or council member has come to an end, that you recognize that there's still a place for you with the league. And so Steve, being a retiring past president and retiring council member, is a perfect face for that. But we'll invite back other past presidents as well.
That's great. All right, well, let's move on to financials. We have the June and July check registers. Nick?
Yes, indeed. I'm glad we got a little bit of heart and soul to discuss before we head into nuts and bolts. But this is our check register for both June and July. You'll remember from our last meeting, Mayor Talbot had requested that we add a little more explanation in the memo/description section, just so that invoice numbers weren't the only things that we know what these are actually for, along with who they're going to. So if you look through, you'll see a little more explanation through each single one of these. I do want to point out a few. If you'll turn to page 6 of 7, you'll see a number of payments to the United States Treasury. Those were past due withholding that we had not paid correctly in the years prior to the major transition. So you'll look and see there September 2013, September 2015, 14, and 16. Through our payroll system, now we're up to date. We're paying the correct amounts, but there's nothing that gets my day going like 4 envelopes from the IRS and realizing, oh, what is going on here? But thank goodness it's old, it's taken care of, and that's just one I certainly want to point out.
Nick, just to add to that, those of you who've been on the board for a while, remember to clean up all of the issues. And so when Nick got these letters from the IRS, the first thing we did was look at the date, and they do all precede the work that the board did. So it's the gift that keeps on giving, but we have paid them, and we're working with them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so I have for each of these checks and the credit cards attached, I have all the documentation right here. So if you have any questions on particulars, I'm happy to do one of those.
Any questions on this for Nick?
I know Mayor Talbot's not here, but does this description meet the needs of the board? Is that what you're looking for?
I think it's good. Everybody, what do you think?
I think so.
I really appreciate it. I think it makes a world of difference. This is Miley, so thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, if there are no questions or concerns, I'd entertain a motion to approve the June and July check registers as have been presented.
I'll move approval.
Jeff Silvestani, I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Hi.
Any opposed? That motion carries. All right, Nick, let's go on and go to the personnel and accounting policy updates.
Okay, so you'll look through in your packet, you'll see 3 major changes in our personnel policy. The first one is required by law. We did not have a policy, we did not have a comprehensive policy for personal use of public property because we are a governmental entity. All of our property as the league is public property. We did have some explanations about communication systems in there, but HB 163 passed last year saying you have to have this in place as a warning essentially to your employees so that they don't inadvertently run afoul of the law and commit what can be up to a felony. You'll look through the particulars we've put in here. We wanted it to cover everything but be pretty broad. This along in HB 163, it's not only giving the warning of the employees but also leaving a mechanism for allowing personal use of public property. That way Cameron can send an email to staff allowing them to watch Netflix on our personal laptop while we're inputting numbers or something like that. Because if he wouldn't give that written permission, we would be out of compliance for using that as a personal use, or even watching it on the weekend or what have you. We don't have a problem in our office with this, but we do want to be in compliance with the law. So we just wanted to make sure we put a policy in place that we can actually enforce and that will actually be what we're doing. On the second portion, it refers to contracts for services and what the executive director's authority is to sign certain contracts. We initially put this in place a few years ago to make sure that an executive director wasn't not informing the board and going and entering into contracts and new types of services that the league would offer without consulting the board. The amounts we'd initially put in were up to $25,000, just the executive director, up to $50,000, the executive director with written concurrence from, or excuse me, the up to $50,000 with the president. Anything above $50,000 would have to be okayed by the board. We also, after that was in position, we added a new portion that would say, because of how we were dealing with contracts with the convention, that the executive director could sign with concurrence from the board president time-sensitive and conference-related materials. That way we could book a speaker, which a lot of those checks are actually higher, before we wouldn't have to wait for a board meeting to do that. In practice, having looked at these, it makes more sense to change with some of the contracts we've been signing for conventions, as well as for contract personnel, to change some of those amounts, but still have board oversight in there so that an executive director can't just say, hey, guess what? I think we want to start selling insurance or some other program that we currently don't have. The board has to say, no, you can't enter into a $100,000 contract to offer a new service. We also wanted to clarify, it said in contracts in the bidding section, contracts for professional services, including, I think it lists attorney, lobbyists, and a number of others, that the board has to make that decision. What practice has been is that the executive director hires our contract help, including John and Roger. We have Amy and Nicole who help us with some conference-related things as well. That falls into kind of the personnel purview that an executive director typically has. He can hire a full-time employee that could end up costing far over $100,000 without board approval. So we did include in that section, if you'll see, we kept the portion that the criteria is still established by the board of directors, but that Cameron would sign the contract with Roger or John or anyone else we have helping us contract-wise. The third portion is relatively simple. We've talked about implementing a fund balance policy for us, like a lot of cities and towns across the state have. In looking into that, we operate out of an enterprise fund. So it's not a fund balance in the general sense that you guys have with your general fund where you're capped at a certain amount to put back. So we have no cap. We can save as much in reserves legally as we'd like because we are an enterprise fund. However, we want some direction from the board that we should stay in a certain area. So we put kind of that middle ground in between. We need to have an unrestricted cash balance at the end of the year. We need to have between 25 and 50% of the previous year's budget. The reason we didn't have that is a should. When if you have something big like a remodel where you're actually spending those reserves you've been saving up, you might dip under. You could have a windfall like we experienced with we wouldn't anymore, but in some sort of case, like we had the Municipal Finance Association where money came in that we weren't expecting, that could shift us on either side of 25 or 50, but that the core goal is that is where we're keeping our reserves as an organization, and that is the board directing staff to do so. So,
Nick, can I add one key thing here? Will you explain to people what the year-end unrestricted cash balance was 3 years ago and compared to what it is now?
So 2016, I would have to go back and double check, but we had a negative balance. We had overspent and not brought in the sponsorship donations we were supposed to have. So it was absolutely minimal. Over the past couple of years, we've had it go up to, we've come out at the end of the year with around $500,000 to add to our reserves. Currently, we have I want to say 2 million in the PTIF fund. And going over the numbers that Dave had just sent us, and we'll review the end of year numbers in September for you. We're looking at, I think we're putting 85,000 back to this unrestricted cash balance. That's our terminology for fund balance. We don't have the same requirements as an actual fund balance.
So what is our current percentage?
Our current percentage.
We were going over this in the call last week with Dave and Carrie.
We're at about 40, low 40s is our current percentage. So we will have to look as we're approaching that number of how to spend down some of.
Well, hold on. So we're about 40% right now. And 3 years ago and previous to that, we were zero. So over the last 3 years, starting with Roger as interim director, and over the last couple of years, we this reserve account. I did a survey of league directors and got 17 responses back. And all of them, 17 have between 3 months and 12 months worth of reserves, or 20 to 50, which is how we settled here. If this were a general fund operation of the city, there would be a cap at 25. Because we don't have tax authority and we're an enterprise fund, we wanted to have a little more flexibility. And keep in mind, in this current budget year that you approved in May, we are taking some of this year-end unrestricted cash balance from the website. And so that 40% number will go down a little bit because of the website expense. But we wanted to present to you this policy so that you could then instruct us as staff as we go through the budget every year to make sure that we have these reserves on hand. They didn't exist 3 years ago.
And that is the problem years ago, is that we didn't have enough. If we want to make sure this addresses not having enough and having too much, that we're bringing in too much, and we'd have to look at what we're offering and how much we're spending in that sort of scenario. So this gets us on both ends of that. So I'm happy to, and I'm sure Cam's happy to as well, answer any questions on either one of these three areas. You'll see the pages affected in our policy and what's been removed and added on those pages, and happy to answer any questions.
I have a question. Maybe it's more of a request for a future meeting, not directly about these policy changes, but what you just referred to, and looking at the fact that a couple $1,000s from the IRS can come through, and we have the capacity to pay for that and take care of those kind of needs. But also back to your comments on the NLC and the potential for us to grow some corporate support at that national scale to expand what we do. I would be interested in a future conversation about how staff foresees, and we've alluded to it from time to time, but what would those priorities of expanded programs be or services for cities, so that if we get to a point where that financial capacity is growing, what do you want to do first? And could the board start to have an idea of that horizon if we start to move that way?
Mayor Pike, do you mind if I answer a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I would love to have that conversation sooner rather than later, because by moving to the South Palace, we open up some revenue streams next year that I would like to invest into programming and staff that's going to help our members. And getting back to that question of why we do what we do. And so I would love to have that conversation this fall of, if we are able to grow the revenue by moving to the South Palace year over year, how do we want to invest that in staff? Last year the board authorized resurrecting the position and tweaking it to create the policy director position, and we went out and hired Wayne, and Wayne's been a huge asset for us over the last few months. So I would love to have that further conversation. And the reason that position became a priority was because we had that meeting in St. George 2 Aprils ago now, where you prioritized what you wanted from the organization. And we recognized we needed more in-house bandwidth on the policy research side to help the legislative arm. And so that's what we did. But yes, I think we should have that conversation this fall, maybe right after the conference, so that we can plan accordingly into the next budget year.
Great.
Good discussion, and that's right on, Aaron, so thank you. Is there a number that, Nick and Cameron, is there a specific number? I see the verbiage in the document there, 25 to 50. Do we want to settle on a number, or we just want it to be a range?
So Mayor, over the last 3 years, Nick, jump in anytime here, but the size of our budget has actually fluctuated from ballpark 2.3 million to 3.3 million just over the course of those years. The reason for that is we've been the go-between for a grant from Intermountain Healthcare. Spanish Fork's one of the recipients of that grant. It's $300,000. It's a pass-through, but it shows up in our document. That in my mind, it inflates the actual operating dollars of the organization. So if you had a year-end unrestricted cash balance that was a number rather than a percentage, it takes into account that fluctuation between 2.3 and 3.3 million. Another reason for the fluctuation, as Nick indicated, was the MFA money. Another reason was the remodel. So we've had a bunch of unique circumstances over the last few years. Maybe going forward, we will be able to have a little more continuity year over year as to what the actual budget will be. But again, we're moving to South-House, so hopefully we'll increase our revenues even further that way. So from our perspective, the percentage made more sense than the dollar amount until we had a little more consistency year over year. But open to suggestions.
One suggestion would be that rather than do a 25 to 50% of the previous year's approved budget, maybe take a 3-year range, the average of the previous 3 years approved budget, and you could, that kind of takes care of some of the ups and downs, and you could maybe narrow that range a little bit. Just a suggestion.
The other thing is, you're saying the language you said, Nick, was should?
Yes.
And I think that's important because, again, the things you mentioned, in addition to, if there were a downturn, in the economy, for example, and you had trouble with companies and others meeting their previous commitment, sponsorships, any of those things could cause it to, the budget to need to, or at least us to use some of those funds to help meet a temporary need, for example. I'm comfortable with the range. Not sure if it needs to be as high as 50%, but what do others think?
I'm comfortable with the range. I like the idea of it being should, especially where this will be reported to the board every year, and we can make a decision in a given year if that's going to affect fees or something else, or in the case of, looking forward to hosting the National League of Cities Conference, some big event like that where it may make sense to have, additional funds. So with the reporting and the range, the survey that Cameron did that shows that this isn't out of line with other communities or other leagues in other states, I'm pretty comfortable with it.
Mayor Arvey, any thoughts?
Yeah, my thoughts is we can change it any time, and let's see how it goes for 2 or 3 years, and we might want to change our mind and we might not.
Good point.
Mayor, can I jump in one more time?
Please.
And to echo what Gary was saying, with the National League coming up as a part of those potential new funding or expanded funding programs, I'm curious. I've enjoyed going to league city summits over the years and have enjoyed different ways to experience those communities from city to city. It would be really interesting if the National League can give us, or if you have any ideas how we as a local league can support or enhance the experience of that National League and what that investment might look like when we're considering our in-house priorities, that unique one-time experience that's coming down the line in a couple of years that we need to be saving up for.
Right. I think it's a great point. I learned last week that they have a target of 15 mobile tours and community experiences at each of their fall conferences. And I said, well, I've got a half a dozen at the top of my head right now, but it's going to take some financial investment, and they request investment both from the city, who's the host, as well as from the local league. And so, yeah, I want to make sure we're nimble enough to participate that way.
I think the mayor, do you have a comment too?
No.
So just a quick comment. I would just get back to the kind of principle that Cameron stated about the why. I think we just continue to educate on the why of the league to those we serve, so that it does not appear that we are charging too much for membership dues, that we're in fact, because now you're seeing a shift of focus where we want to train our individuals more so they're more effective. We want to be nimble enough to be able to implement programs that we might need to on a short-term basis. That being said, I know a couple of years ago there was discussion on the ROI of membership. So I think it's always about educating the why as to the membership and how that's translating, so that it doesn't just look like we are off training and we have a repository, when in fact we have cities that struggle perhaps to come up with that membership due, or struggle to make trade-offs for it. So that would be my only caution if we're looking to hold 50,000 or anything in that, because what we're all familiar with is like a 25,000. So what we imagine is kind of the high end. This is double that. Again, a different organization, but again, I think it's about educating on why.
Good point. Thank you, Nicole. Okay. So looking at how we've got this slated, are there other things you needed to talk about? I just show those three, Nick.
Nope, these are the only three that we have now. We are reviewing the policies constantly. I think you've seen we've had a couple updates in the past board meetings. So we will certainly have more going forward as we try and just run as efficiently as possible with the transparency efforts that we put in forward and being able to just operate well. So we'll keep those coming for you, but right now it is just these three.
So Cameron and Nick, would you be ready for us to call for a motion to make these changes as have been presented to us?
Yes, with the caveat that Council Member Barnett made a suggestion. I don't know if it was a motion, but it was a suggestion. So open to that suggestion. But yeah, otherwise would welcome feedback and a motion.
Yeah, I think that's not a bad idea. If someone wants to craft a motion, one way or the other.
I'll make a motion to approve as presented by staff.
Have a motion. Was that Mike?
That was Gary Hill.
Gary Hill, thank you.
I'll second.
Is that a second by Richard?
Yeah.
Thank you. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries unanimously. All right, thank you for the work and the discussion, everybody. Let's go on, Cameron, to legislative strategy and priorities. This might take a little time.
Yes, so thanks in advance for the time and dedication here. Rachel, Roger, Wayne, and I, Carson and John have had a fun summer. Is that the right word? Yes. A fun summer of trying to stay on top of a session-like pace with potential tax reform on top of all of it. You'll see a couple of handouts in your packet. First, a quick reminder about the resolution process. The reason that's in there is because as we engage on issues as staff, we rely on those resolutions to give us our framework. And what I have found in recent years is that policymakers at the state level pay attention to these resolutions. I've mentioned this before, and I referenced it in the memo, but when we as a membership passed that medical marijuana resolution last year, the following week I was in the speaker's office, and both he and his chief of staff had the resolution in front of them that I had sent them, and they'd gone through and highlighted portions of it, crossed out portions of it, and that's where the negotiations started on the special session bill on behalf of local government. And we made great strides in that special session bill on behalf of cities because of that resolution. As we've engaged on the tax task force this summer, we went back and Carson did much of this work and found all of the previous tax resolutions that our membership had passed. And you'll see the 6 of them that are highlighted here. And then Carson went through and pulled out the key provisions. So we didn't have to go through all 10 plus pages worth of documents with the key provisions there. And the question we have for the board, that we'll answer in a few minutes, is there anything else that we need to add to this tax policy as the real discussion gets underway starting August 19th? So with that question in mind, I want to turn it over to board members who attended the task force meetings to just share your thoughts and observations of what you saw from the task force or what you've heard from legislators, including breakfast that Mike and I had with the coach there, Francis Gibson, this morning, or Roger, you can chime in when you and I went up and met with Senator Hilliard, the other co-chair, back in June. And I should mention that Roger did not retire. He is not here because he had knee surgery, but he is on the call and ready to participate. So with that, Mayor Pike, I'll turn it back to you and board members to give your thoughts on what you've observed and what you've heard from task force members thus far.
Yes, please. Let's just have people chime in one at a time, whoever has thoughts. I know a number of you attended, those that were close or in your communities. Richard, Mike, I know many of you did that. Just chime in, will you?
I know the meeting I attended in Richfield, kind of the message that was given to the task force was, be careful what you do with this and try to use more of a surgeon's scalpel than a swather, because you need to understand, they need to understand that their decisions affect us in ways that they don't even think about, particularly those of us in rural Utah. There were two particular points that I spoke actually with Senator Fillmore about after the meeting that are kind of pet peeves of mine. The first being that I think is important for us to take a stand. We see every year, and we're seeing again this year, any number of cities that are proposing substantial raises in property tax rates because councils are reticent to approach that topic until it's a crisis and they absolutely have to. And then we get situations where, like in Sevier County, 2 years ago, the county raised the property tax rate by 70%. We get situations where Monroe City has proposed a property tax increase of a 100% property tax increase, because councils don't want to deal with the truth in taxation hearings every single time, and so consequently, cost of living increases don't get made that we as cities and towns need to function as well. I would like to see the board and the league approach. I'd like to see cost of living increases in the property tax rate be able to be made, however we put a formula together for that, without having to go to a truth in taxation hearing every single time we need to pay 20% more for plumbing fixtures or 20% more for whatever it happens to be. Inflation happens. We need to have some sort of, I feel like we need to have some sort of mechanism to account for that without having to go through, without having to scare councils to death because they don't want to deal with truth in taxation. Then they have to go for 70 and 100%, 150% increases, and it is a big, huge, awful deal. That's the first thing. The second thing is we touched on this briefly just a minute ago, and I spoke with I think it was Senator Fillmore I spoke with about it after the meeting. 7, 8, 9 years ago, the rainy day fund, if you will, for cities was at 18% of last year's budget. I complained to Carl Albrecht about that, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, and we got it raised to 25%. That works. I guess my complaint with that is in cities such as Richfield and smaller, Richfield is the 75th largest city by population in the state. out of the 248. So there are 175 cities, Richfield size and smaller. 25% of our annual budget, a cap of 25% of our annual budget in a rainy day fund. The smaller the city and town gets, the less meaningful that becomes. For cities of the first and second and third class, 25% of your annual budget is a huge amount to put away into a rainy day fund, and I don't know, but I suspect probably never even approach that. For us, 25, yeah, and so I would like to see, and Senator Fillmore said that he would be willing to float a bill that would raise that to 30 or 35% for cities of the third, fourth, and fifth class. I don't know that we even need to go to the third class, but certainly cities of the fifth class, cities under 10,000 population, could benefit from being able to put away a larger percentage or have the ability to have the opportunity to save a little bit when we have good tax years and we haven't budgeted for the full amount and we have a surplus at the end of the year, to be able to put that away so that we can better manage the hard times. Those are kind of the two, and that's kind of my two cents from our discussions.
Thanks, Richard.
Yep.
Who else? Mike, Mayor Niehaus, I know that a number of you went.
Actually, Andy Bierman, I was on family vacation, much needed family vacation. So Mayor Bierman actually came down to Moab and participated in Moab.
That's right. He's got a place down there, doesn't he?
Yeah. Andy, do you wanna give the update?
I don't know if he's still on. Are you still on, Mayor? He had to go.
He was the congressional delegation up there.
Yeah. So others, and I don't know what you might have heard, Mayor Niehaus. Anything you heard about yours?
I heard just the feedback was positive, that the legislators were well received and that the communication was civil and positive. And we, of course, were talking about how the change in tax could greatly impact resort communities. And so I think we just put a fine point on that, and are very anxious to see what they roll out. But it was civil and good, so I think.
Yeah, Mayor, this is Cam, and I was there, as you know, and all of your colleagues spoke, and Representative Gibson stayed after the meeting for an hour chatting about resort community specific issues with me and with a few other individuals, including Mayor Bierman. And then at breakfast this morning with Mike and I, he brought Moab up again specifically of what he heard in that task force meeting. And so the messages off the Wasatch Front really resonated with the task force. I heard that in Roosevelt, and I wasn't at the Richfield when Wayne was, but we heard back from task force members that they heard a very unique perspective when they were off the Wasatch Front listening to local leaders.
Thanks for that, and thank you to you and the league for helping craft that shared message and helping us be really clear that broadening the base is not going to positively. It's not going to help resort communities like Moab and others that are so heavily based on sales tax, that a reduction in sales tax could be just really, really hard hitting.
I think the ripple effect message was delivered, and I hope well received at every location. Is that accurate from what you heard, Cameron?
It was certainly heard. When you ask if it was well received, I can hear Roger chuckling in my head. Ultimately, I think
I'll chuckle out loud in a minute.
I think they're at the point where they just want to start crunching numbers and figuring out a path forward, because they're taking arrows from everybody, and we didn't shoot any arrows at them. So yeah, Roger, what are your thoughts about Mayor Peck's question?
Well, First of all, my apologies for not being there, but for the first time in 8 months, I can actually walk on this knee, so I'm making progress. You did a very, very good job of sending a consistent message of this is your decision to make as a state, because you're talking primarily about your budget, but whatever decision you make, the choice may have an impact on us. And that's all we consistently said that over and over and over again. I think there were some legislators who were frustrated in the sense of, well, give us a solution. We never said it was our job to fix their problem. And I think it's really important that we not get into the position of saying, we think this group ought to be taxed and we don't think this group should be. But all we ever consistently said is if you play a situation of changing bases and adjusting rates, and your goal is revenue neutrality, but no one can get hurt, that's not necessarily a doable premise. And that's all we said is consistently that. And I think that started to at least resonate. I have to say, as a sideline, there were a lot of people that were perturbed with Representative Quinn's House Bill 441 saying, well, we're not going to do that bill. I honestly don't know what they would have talked about at these hearings if that bill had at least not been put on the table for discussion, because at least that provided a framework, if nothing else, what we don't want to do. But I would say you did a very, very consistent job with 90 seconds of portraying this as the concern. I think they are at a point right now, they feel like they need to do something, but there is no consensus from people I've talked to about what that is. I don't even think there's a general consensus over an agreement over what the problem is right now. So anyway, Cam, I thought everybody did a great job. I appreciate them coming. I did, I think, half the meetings and listened to probably most of the other ones.
So I'm curious, everyone that attended these sessions, the one I attended here in St. George, it was packed, and there were a lot of citizens and business leaders, professionals in different industries who were there, very concerned and expressing that concern about broadening the base. Did you all hear that as well?
Yeah, we did in Orem at UVU. The two industries that were represented pretty well were the plastic surgeons were in the room, as well as quite a few law firms, and they spoke. To Cam's point, to Roger's point, our message was, I think, pretty consistent enough that I know it was the last meeting held at UVU, but I was walking in with Senator Hilliard, and he introduced himself to me, and then I did to him, and he said, let me guess, you don't want us to touch the 50-50. You don't have to get to speak. Well, you're gonna have to hear me because I got a thing written anyway, but I think that message came through in all the meetings that they had. And this leads into a little bit of what we discussed with Representative Gibson this morning as well. The education group was at our meeting as well. Quite a few teachers and some administrators of school districts that spoke about education. But in that meeting, I was quite surprised. I don't know how Cam felt about it, but I was surprised that the task force was as open to the discussion of amending the Constitution to take a change there of where the income tax goes for the state.
Yeah.
So that was a surprise for me. I didn't quite expect that. I don't know if that was discussed at the other meetings, but in that vein, and I believe him, maybe it's foolhardy for me to think this, Cam, but I believe Francis when he says, hey, I know some people think these meetings were just a way for us to check the box that we're discussing this with you, and we have the plan and we have a solution of what we're going to do, but we don't, was his response. We really don't. So I think we have the opportunity. I think it was well stated in our meeting that we attended that it would be a complete chaotic situation to try to 248 cities and towns with separate issues that involve tax to try to cap that or try to change that in a whole lot of ways. So our discussion went more to, I think, from a service-based thing to, okay, what can we do with maybe the education piece of it and restructuring that a little bit.
An interesting turn of events at the Richfield meeting that surprised me somewhat was former Representative Kay McKiff stood up and spoke, and his suggestion was to undo what he called the damage they did to the sales tax when they took the sales tax off food, and to reinstitute sales tax on food, and it was very well received by the people in the audience, which surprised me. It got a cheer and an ovation, which it surprised me in the first place that he would say, we as a legislature screwed up with this 10 years ago, whenever it was we took it off. And secondly, that it was so well received that he says, you can fix the whole problem with just putting the sales tax back on food and you're good to go. And it was, yeah, so.
And as a reminder for folks about what that would mean for us, is food is already in our base for the 1%. So if the state were to reimpose the full sales tax on food with the state rates, that does not affect your bottom line for your local 1% revenue. It would affect your bottom line for your RAP taxes, your resort community taxes, and the county transportation tax. But for the local 1%, it wouldn't. I also want to mention that Wayne put together the scripts, the general scripts for each of the 8 meetings. And Wayne, how many times did we bring up 50-50 in those scripts?
I think only once.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it only came up once, but legislators heard that loud and clear. We were bringing up different points at each meeting. So we were not trying to say the same thing in every meeting, which is what you heard from the Bar Association. We had a different line of attack each time, and Wayne put all of that together. So anyway.
So I didn't get a chance to attend any of those meetings, but I did get a chance to go into the enemy camp, or one of the enemy camps, the Utah Bar Convention. And they had, they devoted a couple of hours to talking about this. And actually one of the members on the advisory committee was presented there. And his concern was mainly the stacking problem.
Steve Young.
Yeah.
We're having him come to LPC next week.
Right. Okay. So mainly this, you're talking about making Utah less competitive relative to other states with respect to manufacturing operations that might actually move out, because if they're taxed at all these levels, it makes us uncompetitive, basically. So I'm just wondering if that point was made, other than by Steve Young.
Yeah, it was made repeatedly by different representatives of the Bar Association. I had a legislator say to me when I walked into the meeting in Roosevelt, can't you guys just give us a statement and be done? And I said, no, every comment has been different because there are multiple ripple effects. And then in his closing remarks, he said, the 2 things I've learned during this effort is that the Bar Association is organized and the League of Cities and Towns is organized. And I think he meant to insult us, but we took it as a badge of honor. He recognized that. Any other thoughts about what you saw and heard before we talk about where things go from here? All right.
This is John Hiskey. I attended the Kearns. Ron and Brett did a tremendous job representing just exactly what was represented here. The relative to the COLA question, cost of living, Mayor Jenny Wilson from Salt Lake County spoke favorably to that particular issue.
In fact, yeah, she did.
As part of her presentation. So just to amplify that it is getting more broader participation relative. Thank you.
It's actually a perfect segue. If Mayor Pike, I don't know if there's anybody else who wants to chime in on what they heard before we move to where we.
Let's try to move along, to the what's next.
Okay, so Roger, speak up any time here, but John gave a nice segue into where the cards are on the table as of August 12th. The task force will meet next Monday, and they plan to meet every couple of weeks over the next couple of months to dive potential options. As a quick recap, let's just put the 4 state silos on the table here. Silo number 1 is the income tax. And 6 months ago, there was not much appetite to revisit the constitutional amendment on income tax. But as Mike indicated, we heard in that public meeting, as well as in our breakfast this morning, more momentum toward revisiting the income tax.
Cam, let me make this comment about that. What's changed? What's changed on that issue is the realization they cannot fix their siloing problem unless they deal with the income tax. They can delay it, they can push it out, they can buy time, they can do it. They simply can't fix it unless they make an adjustment on that. I think that has hit home now to most of them on that task force.
Over the last couple of weeks, John and I met with the head of the School Boards Association, and then I've met with some reps from the Utah Education Association. Just asked them, where are you at on potential changes to the income tax? At this point, they're not supporting any changes. However, they've also recognized that the politics were shifting underneath them. And so they were trying to figure out how to approach a potential legislative effort to change the income tax. One potential option would be for the state to dedicate a certain portion of the budget to education. So it's no longer tied to income tax, but say a statutory guarantee that a certain portion of the budget is going to education. That's one approach we've heard. Another approach we've heard has been not to actually go to the people with a constitutional amendment, but to go with what's known as the Idaho approach, which is where you could actually get like a, Roger, do you want to explain the Idaho approach? Let's just do that.
Well, basically it's substituting one shell game for another, if it's too truthful. You basically get a credit off your income tax money for sales tax. I have my doubts that will work, but without getting too complicated, that's what it really is. It's a way of end running the earmarking.
Yeah. So a third option on the income tax, and this one could have major ripple effects in the positive for us, would be if the legislature said to the education community, we're going to change the silo on income tax, but we're going to make it easier for local school districts to raise property tax. So that way you may see, and who knows if they'd even see less state money, but potentially less state guarantee of money in exchange for more local flexibility to raise funds through property tax. Well, clearly, if the legislature tries to extend some flexibility to school districts, then that brings in cities and counties and others. And as John indicated, the counties were very aggressive in every meeting, bringing up truth in taxation. That was their message. Whereas for us, Dr. Barnett brought it up on behalf of the League in Richfield, but that was the only mention we had in the meetings. The counties were full speed ahead on that. So for us as an organization, we need to think seriously about where we would want to be if that sort of opportunity presented itself. Okay, so that's income tax, property tax. Now there's still two other revenue streams out there that are being considered. The big enchilada is sales tax. That was the focus of 441. My feeling is that there's still some chatter about base expansion, but not to the degree that 441 contemplated. There is some low-hanging fruit out there. Let's call them the Ubers and the Lyfts. So things that are not professional services, but could easily be collected and remitted. You're streaming on cell phones and the like. The question then becomes, will the legislature feel like there's enough new money in this base expansion? And I'm not putting food in this conversation right now, just those currently untaxed goods or services, that there's enough new money for them to say we're lowering the state rate and therefore we want to lower the local rates or change the formula or put your money in a lockbox. So essentially a smaller scale of what we saw with 441. When you throw food on top of that, it makes for an even more interesting conversation. The fourth component to all this is the motor fuel tax, which got some discussion during the 8 task force meetings, but not as much as those other 3. And as a reminder on the motor fuel tax, we as locals share the motor fuel tax with the state. 70% of it goes to the state, 30% goes to locals. Of that 30%, 64% goes to cities, 36% goes to counties. That 70-30 split was a result of negotiations back in 2007 when we actually gave back some sales tax money to the state in exchange for that formula going from 75-25 to 70-30, and we picked up more gas tax. Then there's additional formulas within the gas tax about how the money gets allocated between urban and rural areas. So you have all those four pieces out there. If the legislature just focuses on income tax and doesn't provide any flexibility for school districts on property tax, then we spend a lot of time wringing our hands for really nothing because there's no real ripple effect on locals. If they go the route of being open to some changes to truth in taxation, that affects us. But one thing we've heard loud and clear, including this morning again from Representative Gibson, is they don't want cities to have a windfall. So if they make it easier for us to raise property tax, will they expect a pound of flesh in return somewhat? Or if they expand the sales tax base to a certain degree, will they expect a pound of flesh somewhere, either within sales tax or somewhere else, for example, with the gas tax? We don't yet have answers to those because they haven't actually started discussing those. The listening tour was just that, it was listening. And now you have these four pieces that they'll go into more depth about. The questions for us to answer as a board and as an organization is at the appropriate time, where do we want to be as each of those pieces start moving? Roger, Rachel, Wayne, Ron, Carson, those were at the task force meetings. Anything else you guys want to add?
Let me emphasize a couple of points. There is a legitimate tax policy argument for expanding the sales tax base. Expansion doesn't mean doing what 441 done, but the base probably does need to be modernized, at least incrementally. So in some ways, we never ever oppose base expansion, nor do I recommend, I don't think we ever ought to oppose base expansion. It's a perfect legitimate argument. How big that expansion becomes, et cetera, depends, it dictates the availability of new money. One of the arguments, or one of the things we need to point out is, we have base changes every year with exemptions that are passed, et cetera, et cetera. We never ask for any new money to offset those. And I think we ought to point out, the idea that we can't have a single dollar increase in sales tax revenue without a rate reduction is ridiculous. And at some point here, I think there's an issue of magnitude versus everybody being held to a precise dollar of harmlessness. If they don't include food in the new base, I don't think the dollars are going to be gigantic on the base expansion. That's the big ticket item, because I don't think they're going to go off on services to the extent that they talked about. But the service debate, or the base expansion debate, sort of stands on its own merit. The issue is magnitude. The income tax change, like I said, they really can't fix their problem without dealing with that. And the issue is providing certainty to education and protection of money. The only thing they can do that is guaranteeing a percentage, which again, I don't think is a bad idea, but that doesn't have anything to do with us. I hate to see us trading very much off for losses in other areas just for the option of raising property tax. I mean, we have the option of raising property tax now. And that the other thing is there's a lot more players involved in the property tax arena than just us.
Yep.
And to date, this is the first time the counties have stepped up and really said anything, and we've never heard anything from the school boards.
I do think we're going to hear more from school boards, though, in the weeks to come.
Right, I agree with you.
Hold the income tax. So, Mayor Pike, that's kind of the presentation of where we're at, and we're open to discussion now of how. First, do our resolutions say everything they need to say, and then second, as we are weighing these four options and where cities plug in, what do people think at this point in time?
Cameron, just a thought in terms of kind of fertilizing the field. How much do you think our residents understand about the tax issue? Maybe it would be a zero, right? It would be a zero. Yeah. My point here is we're ready to embark on this really vital narrative with our legislators, and we haven't prepared our citizens to have that dialogue, or at least to participate or understand how that dialogue will in fact directly impact them. I wonder if there isn't some kind of educational campaign that we can do as cities that prepares our citizens at least for an understanding of, in very simplistic terms, the tax situation as it sits for cities right now. So it just simply is a preparation of understanding what taxes we rely on as a city, for instance, what we don't get taxes from. So I'm talking very rudimentary, almost infographic level, but just a basic kind of 101 understanding of tax policy as it pertains to cities and by extension citizens, so that when the narrative starts, at least we're potentially on the same page to have a conversation where you could call in your citizens to have some opinion, because at least they have some level of understanding what we're fighting for on their behalf.
I think it's a very intriguing idea. What was fascinating in these 8 task force meetings, and we had staff or league representation in all of them, was the number of residents who got up after the legislature did their song and dance explaining the problem and said, your data is flawed, or the problem you're describing is not a real problem. It happened everywhere. So to answer your first question of how much does the public know, the public generally doesn't know much about taxes. Even the members of the task force don't understand tax policy. We had members of the task force who said to us, we don't want local government raising sales tax to make up for the state reducing sales tax. And we said, we can't raise sales tax per your law. Nope. Really, you can't? And that was the member of the task force who said that to us. So I think there is value to that if we want to be out in front of the tax debate, because right now they're taking all the arrows and
no, and that's not what I'm suggesting at all, nor do I think that's where we want to position ourselves. That being said, I do think we position ourselves in the arena that is ours, and that is explaining the tax policy by which we live under. So it's just explaining what it looks like from a city perspective today. I'm not saying that we address where things might be shifting, where we want to shift. I am simply saying we need to educate on the status quo. And if you could do that with like graphics, for instance, that come from the league that just simply explain what it is that the terms, if nothing else, that we did, the very, very basic rudimentary, so that we at least are defining what our problem is, so that when the discussion happens, we have had the opportunity to set the narrative by which we are going to move all over the place from. Does that make sense? So no, I don't want to touch anything outside of our lane right now, but just simply explains this is the reality of money as it pertains to cities.
So essentially a message to the residents of Harriman.
Can I make a suggestion?
Go ahead, Mayor.
So what we tasked staff to do for Moab is that on our webpage, we actually have a page that's designated to explain, and we actually link to League of Cities and Towns, the description from the league of what's going on. So if you go to Moab City's website and just search sales tax reform, you can find it, or just search Moab City sales tax reform. And if you want, if any cities want, or if the league wants, we can kind of send the template, because that's what we're using to at least locally get the word out about what's going on. And then specifically where we've got on the website where our city's revenues come from. And so we're just like fact-based putting information out. And I think that that's been really helpful for people in Moab to say, oh gosh, they're looking at reducing sales tax. The majority of our income is sales tax. This could affect us. And so then our citizens can make their own opinions on what's being potentially being proposed.
So Mayor, thank you. And that's essentially what I'm saying. Would there be benefit in establishing, for lack of a better word, and pulling from the mayor, what the mayor said is templates, talking points, all of those things that are consistent throughout all of our cities. Again, I would say we're fertilizing the land for a discussion we know is coming. Positioning our residents potentially to be more informed and be better advocates on our behalf when in fact we are advocating on their behalf. So I'm just suggesting there is in this room and from league staff, you know what's going to come as the discussion gears up. And so there's an opportunity to just do what will feel like a very innocuous education campaign that the mayor is already doing, that just brings our residents up to speed as to the very basics. It's going to be a big conversation to be had. I think it doesn't hurt to educate at least a little bit leading up to it.
I wonder if there is a way, to use your great talent, that cities you could create a formula sort of, or whether it's an infographic or I don't know what it looks like, that cities could fill in our respective courses. You know, the way that Richfield relates is different from the way Salt Lake City relates, and I think we want to make it both
customizable but generic as well.
Yeah, so that we can contextualize each city's relationship to this broader tax conversation. And just as, like you said, stay in our lane, not talking about necessarily what the changes could be, but you can say, look, we get this much sales. Moab has this much sales tax that contributes to our overall revenue. Changes to that conversation could dramatically affect us.
And then everybody's on the watch and on the ready, but we understand where we're sitting right now. Exactly right.
Can I add one point on that? We have on our website now a tab that you can click on. It's called a Housing Clearinghouse, I think. And with that, you find a whole bunch of resources housing related. We can do something similar to what they're doing in Moab, where it's just like a tax task. Right now, we don't want to call it that, but tax.
No, it's still a tax task force.
And because we've got a lot of conversations that Cam's had with others in our podcasts. We've even got, we've got 3 or 4 videos on taxes. You know, what is sales tax? What's an impact fee? You know, other videos like that. And we can just put up a whole list of resources, including if we created an infographic, especially an interactive one. That would be slick if we could do it.
And what's nice is we're a month away from the annual convention. And so we could show it at the convention because they won't have a decision by then. Show it at the convention, hit a lot of our membership broadly that way. You'll have the city managers have a business meeting. So we, we'll have 600 plus people there. So that, and then cities can customize it as you see fit. So what does tax reform mean to the city? Well, without getting into the policy debate, and just focus on.
Because I worry that would hurt us.
Right.
I don't want to appear as if we're trying to get out in front of the legislators that in fact we want to work with.
Right.
A couple of months later. This could be message that we are doing this on behalf of making that future discussion more beneficial to all legislators included, because we have the channels that go directly to the citizens. So it gives us the opportunity to educate and make that debate that's coming more beneficial for both legislators and ourselves and the citizens for that matter.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Jewel.
So, yes, this is Jewel Allen from Grantsville. When we recently approved our budget in our city council didn't have the inclination to approve COLA raises on certain items. And I'm concerned about this property tax resolution. So my question is this resolution reflective of what we are trying to push as a board, or just offering it as an option for our cities? Because frankly, from the discussion we had on our city council, I don't see my city council supporting this.
You're in the board packet, resolution 2016-003.
Correct.
That resolution, the membership endorsed in 2016 in the business session.
Okay.
The directors proposed that resolution. And so part of the reason we pulled these together so you could see them is this is what's providing us with our lobbying foundation as we've been engaging with the task force, because this is what you have told us over the years is the policy of the league.
Okay, so it's not something new, Cameron, it sounds like?
Nope, this is
We've had it in place.
Yes, this is existing league policy.
Right. So I just want to, I guess, say my piece about that. On the one hand, I recognize we're all looking for revenue to be able to do what we need to do as a city to provide services to our citizens. But I guess I just want to, caution, as I've served in my position over the years and since that 2016 resolution, obviously, I just find that when we, as city officials, I think it's easy for us to say, well, we are keeping up with inflation, but then so are our citizens. And I know that every time there's some expense or raise in anything, taxes or fees, there's always pushback. So I think we just want to be cautious, not to make it so it's an easy out for us as a city to not have truth and taxation processes, because I think that is the reason that's in place, is so that we are not complacent and just assuming that our citizens will just have to go along. We do not give them an option, whether or not we should increase charges for our services.
Any other thoughts? Well, it sounds like from the input.
I've got one just real quick thing.
Go ahead, Mayor. Yeah.
At some point, so what I'm hearing loud and clear is that we're going to be, as a league, having a real fact-based conversation, and that, and Roger reiterated this, that we're not taking any one particular position, and that we're going to gather all the information and make sure that we're all informed. But I just wanted to ask the board, like, at some point, are we going to go be more bold than, like, in the resolution, it talks about the 50-50, that's the one, don't please maintain the 50-50 distribution, but otherwise it's just like, we're going to continue to educate. Does anybody on the board think that we're going to be more bold, or are we really going to maintain neutrality other than the 50-50?
Just my perspective, but I would think we will be bold. I just think probably the time is not yet, other than to continue to communicate kind of those foundational principles that we've been talking about. But right now, we don't have anything else to really respond to, is my perspective. Cameron, what would you say?
I think you're both right. I think the position we took on 441 during the session was measured, but protected our interests without alienating the legislature. You can't say that about the Bar Association or some of the other entities. And in their defense, they were about to be taxed. So of course they were going to be uber aggressive. So right now, there's not a proposal on the table for us to take a position on. What we're trying to make sure is that we have all of our ducks in a row, so that when things start moving, and it will move quickly, that we're all on the same page of what these policy foundations are in the resolutions. If there's something we need to add to it, that we do that over the next month. And then as different proposals come out, Mayor Niehaus, we relay those proposals back to the board or LPC or both to get as much feedback as possible, so that then we can take bold positions as necessary.
So one caution I would say is, I don't think the position is one of conflict avoidance as much as it is roles of government. Bear in mind, by law, we accept the state sales tax base, so whatever they choose to tax or not, we're required to roll with that. If they choose to tax attorneys, are we saying we have a position on whether we should or shouldn't do that? We largely have taken the position of, if you choose to tax it as a state policy, that's your decision. Our impact is if you adjust rate after that to try and achieve some degree of neutrality, that's when we have a problem. And that's, I would argue, I'm not sure, you know, obviously do what you want, but I don't see how you ever get out of that mode. I mean, unless we're going to take a position of saying we just don't think something should be taxed because our city doesn't want it, that's fine. But for example, on food, we already have food in our base. So that debate of including it only applies to the peripheral rates. On whether the income tax should be constitutionally protected for education or not, it's hard for me to see how that matters to us as cities at all. That's really, you know, a policy call they've got to make a decision. Does that constitution need to be changed? I do think there's a real involvement with if they were choose to change the formula on gas tax, because that really is an internal allocation. The 50-50 has been able to have a hard position because our view was that hasn't got anything to do with your siloing problem, state. That is a peripheral issue which you're using this as a means of getting at something that some of you have been after for a long time. And so we could easily take a position on that. But I think it's important to understand that some of these are policies that are already set. The state sets the base. We apply a rate against that base. The issue is what's the impact of that?
Well, and then Roger, what I've said before, I'll say again, but then there's the other kind of the aspect or the other hat that we each wear as elected officials in terms of how it affects the businesses and individuals.
Absolutely.
In our cities. And we can't forget that hat either. I mean, I'm being asked constantly to, you know, what do you think about this, Mayor? What do you think about this, council members? You know, anyway, it's, there's that too that doesn't necessarily affect the coffers directly, at least up front of the cities. But, you know, we have a number of businesses and professions that are very concerned about it. And
which is why we've tried to stay out of that fight.
That's right. So anyway, I think what I heard earlier from Nicole and others, Aaron, was let's see what you know, toolkit, what, if you will, what information we can provide, or at least templates that cities can then use. If I understood that right, I think that could be helpful. And of course, anything that all of our cities want to do on their own, as some are already doing, I think that's probably wise to help people that want to understand how we receive our revenue.
That sounds good to me. A couple of quick thoughts is one, the officers put together a letter that summarized the comments that all of us made at the different task force meetings. We've not yet shared that letter with the tax task force. We're waiting until they come back on the 19th, giving them a little break, but as it gives a recap of what they heard. We may want to do an op-ed from the officers that, you know, at the appropriate time explains the ripple effects in more detail, and then, you know, think through the messaging at the annual convention when we have 600 of our folks there at any given time to make sure we're all on the same message. You know, to that point, Mayor, you'll have the chance as president to speak. We've got the business session on Friday, and there are other times where we could bring this up. We do have LPC next week, but we'll have a bigger cross section of members at the Capitol on Wednesday during the lunch hour with Steve Young from the Tax Task Force, who will be speaking. And then, we can proceed with the idea of the template for how cities can explain to their residents of what tax reform could mean for them.
Okay.
Can I just share one more quick thing? And it does, no response needed, but I think it's because we're in back to school mode here in my family and in the community. And I can't help but wonder if we as a league are going to talk about the implications of this reform with respect to It just feels like the notion of the income tax having so much money, and like I just don't. I feel like there's this like quiet threat of our public education losing money because it should be shifted. And as a mom that's shopping for back to school supplies, I feel like we as a board should respond to that sentiment of tax reform as well. So I just wanted to put that out there too for future consideration. And I appreciate Mayor Ramsey shaking her head yes.
Yeah, and Mayor Ramsey is someone who has deep roots in the public education community. Do you have any thoughts about what you've heard on the discussions around the income tax at this point?
I know that the education community is really quite concerned about it. I had some conversations this morning with a state board member and some of the administration of our school district, and visited with some of the local board members just last week about this, and I know that they're all watching it. And, you know, I heard what Roger said, and part of my brain can react to, maybe it isn't the city's problem if education funding gets undone, but personally, I disagree. If education funding gets undone, it does affect the residents in our city. It affects the quality of education. If education funding, which is already the lowest in the nation, takes a hit, that does matter. It matters to me not only as a mom, but it matters to me as the mayor who has a ton of schools in my city. And, you know, that really does matter to me. So it is something that I'm watching very closely, and I agree. I do think it's something that, if what they come back with is going to really adversely affect K-12 funding, it's something I personally would take a stand on, but I think it's something that we need to look at how that affects the people we represent, not just our ability to run our own local governments and to fund our own programs, but what's that going to do to the people that we represent? Because if that's a negative impact that's going to cause a hit, then I think it's something we should weigh in on. So it's something I'm watching closely, and anyway, that's my thoughts on it. It matters a lot to me.
It seems like
Mayor, I have to correct one perception was left here. I was not saying cities don't have an interest in education. I was a lobbyist for UEA for a number of years, so I have deep ties to the education community. When I was a lobbyist for UEA, I told them at the time there is going to be a day of reckoning over the income tax constitutional earmark because we're the only state that does it in the country. It is not a protection of funding for education. And so please don't misconstrue any of my statements here is that I do not have a commitment to public education. My comment was, it does not have a direct issue on the solution that affects cities in that regard. There's obviously going to be a huge debate over that issue, but I don't want to leave it, I can't leave a perception here that I don't care about education.
Well, and I apologize for that. I didn't mean that you don't care about education, but I can understand you're saying, you know, if they change the education formula, that doesn't have necessarily a direct impact on us as cities funding-wise. But yeah, I agree with you. It does matter. I think in the big picture it matters, and we all have a role, both the education community and those of us in local government, to try to help the legislature get this right in the big picture, not just right for some organizations and others pay dearly. I think we need to work together to get this right. So Roger, thank you.
Well, and I think we can monitor, you know, our education partners and see as we get further along in this, whether it's something we need to jump into or not. I mean, my perception is that just because they change, and I think Roger alluded to this, just because they change what the income tax is able to fund doesn't mean that education would suffer at all.
Yeah, they have nothing to do with each other.
Yep, it really doesn't.
And I think we need to remember that when it says education, it's not just K-12. It's higher ed also. And
that's correct.
More and more of that income tax budget in the last years. So we need to get them involved too.
And to date, I've not heard much from the higher ed folks.
Yeah, That's
Met multiple times with the K-12, but not higher ed.
what I'm saying.
And I'm sure over the course of time that will change. There's experts in all of these arenas that are very passionate as well. I just appreciate the opportunity to weigh in on that. I do think that it does matter to me, and it's something I think we should at least be aware of. And then as policy starts to be formed and we have the chance to influence it and have these conversations, I just would like to be mindful of all of it. But I think that's what we all want. So I think we'll be okay.
Sounds good. Cameron, what else do you need before we go on? Do you have a feeling, a consensus of feeling on these issues that we can move forward?
Yep, my one request is that by the end of the month, if you see anything in those resolutions that you feel like needs to be modified, to let us know so we can get the resolution prepared before the conference. If everyone's comfortable with the language that's already there, then we'll just keep trucking along.
Sounds good. You all have copies of those. Let's make sure we get feedback to Cameron or staff and make sure that they can address any of those changes before we have our conference. All right, Cameron.
Okay, Rachel. As much as you need. No, because
We're running ahead.
Yeah, well, no, ledge stuff goes till 2, so we're fine.
Yep.
Thank you. So I wanted to give you an update on the various topics of conversation we've had in the land use task force this past interim, or so thus far this interim. And this year, not only have we been convening the regular land use task force, which encompasses both our home team meetings and then our joint meetings with the Property Rights Coalition, we've also been convening some subgroups underneath the land use task force. So those subgroups have included discussions on gravel regulation, which is an after effect of HB 288 from this past session. We've had a number of meetings, both with our internal working group on gravel, and then also in conjunction with gravel pit operators and their representatives from around the state. So I think we're making progress on this topic. We may not reach everything on gravel regulation this year, but I do think we've got some good progress made, and we've got some thinking to do about what strategy we'll need to pursue on the items that we don't reach consensus on. So we're having conversations with legislators who are friendly to us and who are very interested in running a very practical bill if we don't get there with the legislators. So happy to talk more about that for those of you who are interested. The second group that we've been convening this year is focused on stormwater and low impact development for water conservation. This is something that we're doing at the request of the Division of Water Quality, and also because there is the threat of legislation if we don't reach consensus with home builders and the Division of Water Quality on stormwater regulations going forward. So Division of Water Quality is given this authority by the EPA to essentially figure out what our stormwater retention needs to be in the state and how to get there. The Division of Water Quality has taken a really aggressive approach on retention standards. In Utah, the home builders don't like it, and a lot of our cities are having trouble figuring out how to reach the 90% compliance standard that Division of Water Quality has set out. We also have one of the members of leadership in the House is really, really interested in this topic, and he's also a developer, and so it's kind of an interesting situation with stormwater this year because we're finding ourselves on more aligned with the home builders here and less aligned with the state. So we're still kind of working through the technicalities behind what the stormwater permit needs to say, and then related to that, what standards cities will be able to meet or will need to be able to meet in terms of low impact development. So that's another subgroup that's been operating this year. The third subgroup that we've been having discussions among is focused on building inspection. And this really stems from two things that we continue to hear from home builders and developers, that building inspectors both are failing to meet timelines that we've set out in statute in terms of getting plan review done for residential developments, 14-day timelines that we have agreed to over the last, that we put into place 2 years ago, right? 3 years ago. 2 or 3 years ago at this point. So that some cities, especially in our fast-growing cities, they just don't have the staff, they don't have the capacity to meet that 14-day time review or plan review timeline. And then the second issue with building inspection is there's the allegation out there that some building inspectors simply just don't care what the law is and flaunt what the building code says and put additional requirements on home builders to meet before they'll either give building permits or certificates of occupancy and other things that developers need to move forward. So part of this is really a staffing issue, and that's kind of why we brought it up, both to the UCMA board over the last year and to this group, is just in the faster growing cities, we're really trying to think creatively about how to share labor among building inspectors and how to help us all meet those timelines. Then there's kind of a group of the land use task force members that try to work with the HBA, with the state office of building, basically DFSCM, on kind of problematic cities, or when we hear allegations of cities who are not, or building inspectors who are not complying with the law, to be able to reach out to them and discuss kind of what the problem is, what the miscommunication is, so we can resolve those problems without legislation. So the building inspection issue is not really a legislative item at this point, but it is more just trying to problem solve and then also strategize long-term how we're going to be able to, meet the needs of our faster growing communities when every city seems to be struggling to attract and retain building inspectors in their departments. So those 3 things I wanted to put on the radars there. The other things for the 2 other things with the land use task force this year. One is that we will have a bill that, will have some just cleanups in it on boundary line adjustments and other, cleanups in the subdivision code. We're working on that. That should be the kind of our typical consensus legislation that we see in the land use task force each year. And then finally, what probably warrants a little bit more detail is the idea of damages or penalties on cities that are not complying with their own land use codes. I talked to you about that a couple of months ago at your board meeting, this idea of criminal penalties. And this is something that has come up over the last several years with the Property Rights Coalition. And again, this year at the outset of the Land Use Task Force, we were told by the Property Rights Coalition that this is their #1 priority. That, we've done some great things with trying to clarify the statute over the last several years, but there is the allegation out there, the narrative out there that cities, and in particular elected officials, respond to public clamor in a way that encourages them to just violate their own land use ordinances when it comes to administrative type land use approvals. So, like I said, we talked about this, it was in June, right? At the June board meeting. And I just want to say that it still is, I responded to the PRC and said, I don't think that this is something that we're not going to be able to have a meeting of the minds on this going forward this year. And they, I think, are still going to pursue this regardless of whether or not, we actually get consensus among the land use task force this year. So a few ideas are circulating out there, and I think really the question, and I want to give you some information on those ideas, but I think the questions here really for us are, should we be trying to find middle ground with the Property Rights Coalition on this? Is there a way that we can find middle ground to come up with some kind of a scheme that is fair to cities and fair to developers? Or should we just be shutting this down and kind of, rolling the dice in a way and seeing what they come up with, and if they really do push forward with kind of the most draconian version of the bill. Right now, the reason I think that we need to continue having conversations about this is, Meg and I have both met with Fred Bateman, the Property Rights Ombudsman, and he's told us that this is something that he sees. He has observed it himself, where elected officials, respond to public clamor and intentionally, whether or not it's maliciously, I don't know, but intentionally violate their land use code. He says that he is called by city officials, elected officials and staff and told that this is happening. And he says it is a problem. I've asked him to share particulars about that, and he's uncomfortable sharing details on, where and when this has happened, which I understand. He's the third party neutral in this realm, and I don't want to, put him into a bad spot. He says he doesn't collect statistics on this kind of thing, but he did share with me that 3 times in the last 6 months, he's personally aware of circumstances where this has happened in cities. He's not a fan of the idea of penalties because he doesn't think that makes sense. That's good policy. But what he likes right now, this idea that has been put forward by members of the Property Rights Coalition, that underneath the Property Rights Ombudsman statute, in addition to a party being able to collect attorney's fees, if the office issues an advisory opinion, and then the parties litigate, and the court decides, in line with what the Property Rights Ombudsman has decided, the prevailing party can collect attorney's fees currently under the statute. He likes this idea of the prevailing party also being able to collect some kind of compensatory type damage. So he likes this idea because there's some due process there, right? So a party that wants to dispute a land use decision goes to the Property Rights Ombudsman, asks for an advisory opinion. At that point, the city has the opportunity to say, okay, we got it wrong, let's fix it. And if they don't, then the parties litigate, then there's a whole other level of process there where the court, again, makes its own, it's a de novo, it's a whole new trial, basically. Like, the court doesn't have to take what the Property Rights Ombudsman said as, it's not really in the record. So then the court finds consistent with that position. And then the parties would then litigate this idea of damages. So he likes the idea that there's a lot of process involved in this kind of scheme. There are some problems with that. We can talk about that. There's a couple of other ideas too out there. One is, again, making this part of the Ethics Act. So where, a party could bring an Ethics Act violation against an elected official who intentionally, or the charge would be intentionally or willfully violates their land use code. The third idea out there is that there would be some kind of a liquidated damages type provision in the statute saying that if the ombudsman issues an opinion, it's later litigated from the date that the ombudsman issues his opinion to the date that the court reaches the resolution, there's kind of a liquidated damages flat fee of $1,000 a day or whatever that number would be. And the idea behind all of these is not that, or at least from the Property Rights Coalition perspective, is not that people would be pursuing damages, but that the threat of being able to collect those damages, which would cover things like hard costs of delay or increase in prices of concrete or other types of those kinds of provable hard damages. The threat of that would be enough to convince elected officials that they have to follow their land use code regardless of what the public is clamoring for. So that was probably a lot to kind of just put all out there at once. But there's a lot to consider, I think, with each of these. The first idea of compensatory damages doesn't find fault, right? There's no issue, there's no talk of the ombudsman saying, okay, this elected official willfully or maliciously made a bad decision or violated land use code. There's no allocation of fault there. That kind of thing would already take it out of governmental immunity, and it would already, wouldn't be covered under your insurance or anything like that anyway. But it's very broad, right? It's anybody in the city who would make some decision that's against, violating ordinance would be kind of opening the city up to this idea of compensatory damages. That's a pretty considerable amount of liability there. And I'm not sure if that really gets the Property Rights Coalition where they want to go. if the real problem here is allegedly that elected officials are willfully violating land use code.
That's not where they want to be.
What are you thinking?
They want the same thing they've always wanted, which is entitled, fast, no resistance land use approvals. And all of this is just one more step to get that. And, you know, for those of us that have been involved for 20 years, it's always one more step towards this. We had the same conversation, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago on whether or not we were going to allow the ombudsman's opinion lead to payment of attorney's fees. And again, that was our effort, our belief, I think, to say, look, we're going to negotiate in good faith and we're going to address their stated concern. And now we're back again with, in June, let's criminalize decisions or let's require, 6 hours of training per year for our volunteer planning commissioners, who it's hard to find anyway. What they really want is they want entitled land use decisions. And all of this is just trying to get closer and closer to that. I don't know why we consider any of these options from a policy perspective, any of them. It's the same thing that we said in June, which was, why would we consider criminalizing decisions of our elected officials? The problem with negotiating on anything like this is that's not what they really want. And if we negotiate and if we come to a consensus a year from now, like we've seen over and over, they point back at us and say, well, there was consensus on this bill. We need to take the next logical steps and remove the process that Brent likes so much. It's too long. It takes too long. How many times we've heard that from the development community? The decision is still taking too long. Well, this process that they're proposing that Brent kind of likes, it's going to take forever. And so the next logical step is, well, then let's take out the decision by the ombudsman and just go straight to the courts. Let's put in a writ court provision. It's all these tactics we see over and over and over again. You can tell I feel kind of strongly about this.
No, that's good. I mean, I think you're right on in that, we can, with the best intentions possible, make things very narrow and put all this process in, right? But then over time, that tends to get lost in more. The reason I think, that we still need to take this seriously is because the property rights ombudsman is going to tell legislators that yes, this happens, and there will, if he is, as the third party neutral, out there kind of saying, yeah, these things happen, elected officials do this, then it gives a lot more credence to what the property rights coalition is asking for.
But we don't have the other side of the story, which is, where is this happening? This Manaway, is this Circleville? And
they never tell us that.
They will never tell us that. And second, what was the resolution and how quickly did it come? And the problem will never be fixed by these penalties because we will always have new elected officials and new planning commissioners. The answer is education, still, I believe, and not penalties that don't actually help either side in the argument, but just simply continually weaken our policy position. And I don't disagree. It's harder when Brent's on that side. Brent's a really guy, and I'm sure if push came to shove, where really are these happening, and what was the resolution? I guarantee than what they're proposing by opinion by the ombudsman, and then a de novo hearing in court, and then whatever compensatory. And I don't think the legislature is willing to go to criminalizing decisions by elected officials. If the PRC wants to go forward with that, well, then let's have that argument. I just
can't hear you right now. You can.
To me, I think we need to send a message to go back and negotiating on this, and therefore to the PLC. This is not solving the issue. That's my opinion, and it's strong, and I'll shut up.
I agree with you. I mean, I know we have this, and Brent is coming from this mediator's role of confidentiality, but what ends up happening with it when if there isn't detail to it, it's anecdotal, it's a story, and 90% of these cases are where somebody is trying to push the envelope and hasn't gotten approval, hasn't done something right, and there is a legitimate reason that they're not getting a speedy process. It's because they're trying to cut a corner. And so I think you have to say, look, if you want to address this issue, we need to know the specifics so we can address it, because you can't implement a solution to everybody, even the good actors, because of even one or two bad situations. But I want to look at those bad situations because a lot of the ones that I've heard about before are ones where there's an explanation. It's not what's being portrayed.
So a question for Rachel and Meg, because you guys have done Herculean work here with the PRC. I know, Rachel, that you followed up with Brent, and he mentioned that there were actually city people who had contacted him in frustration with what their colleagues have been doing. And I know he wouldn't say who, and I get that. Like, if I see why he wanted. Does it make sense for us to follow up maybe through the UCMA listserv or through planners or some way to just try to ascertain for ourselves where these bad actors are, try to get more context, just going through our own internal channels?
I think so. I mean, I think all of us want best practices, right? And we all hate when a city goes off the rails and it ends up in legislation that affects us all. I think if we can find out, what the circumstances are, I think that's personally a good strategy.
Because what worries me is what Rachel referenced, that if Brent Bateman, who's viewed as the third-party person, goes up, is called to the Capitol, and PRC has influence in leadership, and they say, Brent, explain the problem. Brent does, and they say, here's how we can solve it. That puts us in a really tough political situation. Now, you pay us to be in tough political situations, but that piece of it worries me, and so I'm curious to hear others.
I have a few thoughts. So I'm just gonna put on different, so my husband works for D.R. Horton by way of just putting out that. So I hear about the bad practices of cities all the time, frankly, and I do think they exist. So I'm often, when we're sort of downloading at the end of the night, and I may be complaining about a developer and he may be complaining about a city, and I would say there's truth somewhere in between. So without a doubt, there are cities that are demanding things from developers that are unfair, having them pay for things that are unfair simply, and then the developer really doesn't have any options because they need to move forward. So there are bad acts happening, without a doubt. So I think acknowledging that there is room for improvement in cities is not a bad thing, and it's a good place to start. I do agree with your assessment, however, that they're looking for more than they're kind of articulating. So I think protecting our areas. And I wrote down, it's funny that you said that, Gary, because I wrote down training. As you were talking, to me, this is fundamentally a training issue, because whatever enforcement you put at the end does not take away from the fact that, particularly in the growing communities, this is only going to get worse. Because all of a sudden, and now I'm putting on a Harriman hat, you've got residents who have been empowered, which is a good thing, other than the fact that they've been empowered and now have become obstructionists as a result, and use the referendum as a tool to be, or the threat of a referendum to be obstructionists and make really ridiculous demands of developers that then put us in places where, and I've articulated this, where we have won a battle but lost a war. And Olympia Hills, I think, is a good example of that. There has to be places where we come together as cities and citizens and developers and have conversations about the development that is an attempt to be as much of a win-win-win as possible. Because right now you have new elected officials that will come in under the clamor of citizens that are tired of growth and want to halt growth. And that scenario is going to repeat itself over and over and over again every single election. And so you will have an ousting, potentially, an ousting of any city elected officials that are willing to make the tough growth decisions for newbies that are only willing to listen to the clamor of the people. people. And if there is not a really strong training program as to the why of how to effectively develop, even in the face of tough, public clamor, you'll just have rubber stamps. I mean, I really envision a serious issue with like your West Side, as people come in and only are willing to listen to their very vocal citizens as to what is to be done with land use, whether it should be done or not. So I really think a strong training program that builds in the political courage and the why and what they have to do and what they should do as elected officials, and much of that is the tough decisions. So in retrospect, I think there's room for improvement. I think we admit that. I also think with our new website, it might be valuable to have areas where we're educating on bad practices and sharing good practices as well, in like a little portal section perhaps on those big issues. And then we show successes. I know Provo, and I'm just learning, is building a whole new development department because they recognize that there is improvement to be had, and you'll see a streamlining of approvals if all goes well and they put this into place. And then I think we start to tout those types of things. Cities that are making changes to fix and efficiencies and work with developers. So I think it's a multifaceted solution. And in no way do I think it is just settling on, the three options that the PRC gives us. But in fact, it's a multitude of things that we can do. Training being, I think, one of the more important ones.
I want to add just a couple of things that you said. I mean, I agree training is important for planning commissioners, that volunteers, and that's where a lot of this happens. And a lot of the dialogue that developers hear that they don't like comes from untrained planning commissioners who kind of will say almost anything that comes into their mind. So I mean, the luau training and stuff like that are all good, but we need to stress more about that and have them remember we're making records. Don't think that the pressures that you get are only on the West Side growing communities. We deal with that on infill all the time, maybe even more intensely because somebody's building something right next door to somebody. And then the last thing I want to say is this is something that Brent said at the bar convention. So he gets this, okay? And I think you can use him as an advocate for this. What he said is the problem that municipal governments have is the wheel of democracy, okay? So what we get is we get people that get elected. They think that they get elected on a no-growth platform or whatever, and then they learn real quickly that they have to enforce ordinances and rules, and they can't just say no. And so in trying to work things out and make it better, they get
campaign promises.
Yeah, and then they get voted out by the people that say, oh no, we don't want growth. And that's the wheel of democracy, where you are constantly getting a new group of elected officials that are elected on a platform of no growth, really, because that's really popular, right? Because nobody wants change. So one of the things that we need to do in our advocacy is talk to legislatures about that problem. That if you continue to hamper local government in terms of trying to do, just reasonably shaped development so that it is acceptable to both sides, acceptable to the developer and the community, because that's our job. That's what we do, is work out that compromise. If you weight the scale that way, then you're not going to make the problem better. You're going to just force the people that are trying to be reasonable out of office.
Good point, Mayor. Thank you.
I just want to chime in. I agree wholeheartedly with what you just said, Mayor. Already our hands feel tied, and we're already feels like a walk on eggshells every time we make decisions like this. And I really don't see why they're putting more restrictions on us other than trying to muzzle us further as city officials. But you're right that if they keep doing that, there's nobody that can be their allies in in city government, and so they're shooting their own, foot. So I hope that we can somehow, still, work within what we can to seem cooperative, and yet at the same time, really, when I hear about these legislative efforts, it just feels more ridiculous every year.
So Rachel, Meg, my question for you is how realistic do you think it is to call the bluff of the PRC? We've said no to penalties forever. Every year they try a different tack. This is the first time that this is the first time they've put in writing an expansion of the judicial remedy with a favorable judicial finding that's consistent with the property rights ombudsman's advisory opinion. So it's the first time they put something like that into writing. How realistic do you think it is to call their bluff and just say no versus keeping the dialogue alive? And again, what have you heard from our folks who you've been leading within the home team on it?
At the last home team meeting, when we talked about this, people needed some time to kind of let it percolate and think about the implications for governmental immunity. I think even as I've been thinking about it over the last little while, if we do just say no to the Property Rights Coalition and they kind of go with this first idea that I told you about, just adding compensatories to the ombudsman statute, I think it's complicated to try to explain to legislators, and it will be complicated to try to explain to them in the heat of the session if there's a bill that's reflecting this, why this doesn't work, but I think we can do it. There's a lot of nuances there with governmental immunity, and I don't think that the legislature is, let me strike that. I think there are enough legislators who are protective of governmental immunity and their own immunity that they don't want to necessarily erode it, even in a way that seems somewhat narrow. So I think we can explain that.
So for example, an environmental advocacy group that wants to sue over a decision that the state has made.
Right. So I mean, I think we can equate it enough to things that they would be concerned about, to at least get the rank and file with us on that. I think they could also, if we say no, they could just go for broke and go for criminal penalties. And I think that's even easier for us to, that's actually probably more clear for us to be able to just convince the rank and file legislators that, you know, is a terrible idea. There's always the danger though that, you know, especially in the heat of the session, you're trying to explain complex legal arguments to legislators, that, you know, you're rolling the dice a little bit there, but that's kind of is what it is. And yeah, we'll do it.
Is my last two cents for the board to consider is they've asked for this year after year after year, as long as I've been here, and Gary referenced that a moment ago. So on one hand, we keep saying no, they're going to bring it up again next year, bring it up again the year after that. On the other, if we do something that meets with the approval of the neutral third party in Brent Bateman and the Property Rights Ombudsman's office, that allows us to play more defense for 8 to 9 years, which is what the creation of the PRO has allowed us to do for the last 8 to 9. Doesn't mean the pressure ever goes away. It relieves some pressure in the moment. The question is whether it's worth trying to relieve the pressure in light of the other policy considerations.
Well, you don't discount the environment we're in too. This is a different, scarier environment because of the housing shortage, and they make different decisions in the environment we're in.
And ultimately, I mean, Gary, I couldn't agree more. This isn't what they want, and so the idea that we will be negotiating kind of temporary peace, I think, was your point, and I agree with that.
And then they always point back and say, well, you supported this, which means you supported the concept. That's their narrative, whether or not it's true. And it's really hard when they've pointed at legislation that we've supported for us to come back and say, well, we've changed our mind. It was really about this piece and not that piece.
I will say though, just to add to that, training doesn't get us far enough here because that's not what they're after.
Right.
Like the story is that it's regardless of training, like elected officials know what they're supposed to be doing and they are willfully not doing it. Like they know. It's not that they don't understand their obligation. They are ignoring their obligation and flaunting it. So there's no confusion there.
But if they're saying it's willful, they really ought to share their instances then, because then all of a sudden there's intent.
Yeah.
So if it's just a not knowing, that makes sense for hiding the bad actors. But if you are specifically saying willful intent to impede process, then probably you ought to be willing to admit names before you put in sweeping legislation to that effect. I think.
There's another fact here that maybe some of us who've been in this boat would appreciate more. If you've ever been in a situation where a city council, for example, goes against staff's recommendation and hires somebody besides the lowest bidder, you immediately get sued by that contractor. And that's usually to the tunes of tens of thousands of dollars, not hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. If you've ever worked with Ivory Development and made an illegal decision, they sue you before you even utter the words.
Well, and Gary, add on to that, you can't even use the bad act. So let's say the low is somebody that has been in my community and has done really shoddy work. And I, as a city council member, would not want to vote to ever use them. And yet, for fear of litigation, you continue to let subpar work come into your community for fear you're going to be sued. Does that make sense?
See, that,
not at all.
That doesn't make sense. This would exacerbate that issue dramatically with development approvals, especially as broadly worded as it is just simply a dispute involving land use. Boy, that's so broad. But the other point that I was trying to make is that if there's really a willful decision that's been made by a city, I guarantee you that the development community is suing those cities and getting an answer. It's happening. It has to be happening, because if our concrete contractors willing to do that, and it happens all the time, there's no doubt the development community is doing the same thing and getting an answer. So and again, that's the other piece of the coin that we don't know. What's the resolution to these allegations? Tell us what actually the solution is, and I bet you dollars, prizes up to dollars, that the resolution is quicker than anything they would propose. This is not what they want either. And to paraphrase a good friend of mine, Mark Christensen, this isn't just a camel's nose under the tent. Camel is coming in back.
That's smart.
Can I just say something? This is Jewel Allen. I think this is not the first time we brought up that we haven't had any specific allegations. Before more discussion is made with other parties on this matter, could we at least get that resolved? Because I think it just would be so helpful to know how, how real prevalent these or how truthful these allegations are. At least have something to back it up so that we can go forward in confidence as we hear these. Is this something that we could request the staff to do? It's just ask for specific information.
Staff has, and that's always the wrinkle. They don't want to share it.
Well, we probably should push it further. I don't know. How do you proceed from that?
Well, the reason the PRC doesn't want to give it is because it undermines their own argument. Again, we're talking about they're pushing legislation for something that is not their ultimate solution.
Yeah.
Now, we could probably work better with the ombudsman's office to try and get that answer. And I think, Cameron, maybe that's what you were suggesting, that we combine with a survey through our organization. What are the problems that we're seeing? I agree with Jewel that information is going to be better here. We do want to be better communities. We just don't want to be put in a situation where we're liable for mistakes that ultimately are just going to cause bigger problems.
Well, and if you thought it was hard to get an elected official to make a decision before, if you attach a penalty, it's going to be that much harder. So it's just situation worse.
So, folks, we need to move on. Cameron, how can we? Have you got enough to be able to proceed on this? Because we're quite over time now.
Yeah. Well, Mayor, Rachel, do you have enough to keep proceeding?
Yep, I think I have the message.
Okay. So Mayor Pike, we will finish on time because we have the time starting and ending, so we can get up to meet with the LG. Real quickly on the 2020 resolution, we talked about this in June. After discussing it further with the officers, we've decided to press pause on a resolution about the 2020 election. Here's why. I chatted with a bunch of directors last week about how their leagues engage in their gubernatorial elections. And they all said to me, you're on the right track. But a policy resolution that says something to the effect of, we want our elected officials to endorse candidates based on these principles, it doesn't quite get what we're trying to get, which is actual feedback from gubernatorial candidates about how they're going to treat local government. Likewise, if we did a resolution that said, here's what local authority means, that is the status quo. A policy resolution is aspirational. It's what we want the law to become as opposed to what the law is. So there's really not a need to have our membership ratify what the law is. It's more about training our membership as to what local authority means, and then taking those principles to individual gubernatorial candidates without endorsing them as a league, but having the two-way dialogue. So for example, several states do statewide public forums with the gubernatorial candidates. Several states bring in gubernatorial candidates to meet with the board of directors and have a dialogue or ask them questions that then the league publishes unedited without an endorsement. But just here are the questions we've asked based on these principles. Here are the responses. Put it out there, and then encourage the membership to use your power of endorsement based on the feedback you're getting. That way it's more tied to the individual as opposed to the overall principles. So after discussing this a little with the officers last week, we decided to press pause on a resolution for annual in this regard, but to still pursue some of these other avenues for engagement in 2020. So that's the first thing. The second thing that's still left is the caucus feedback. We've designed the caucuses to try to get feedback from our members on policy issues and the communities of commonality. In 2018, we brainstormed with them at mid-year. We took the housing bill to them last fall, and the caucuses gave feedback that helped implement that bill. In this past spring, we asked the caucuses, what topics do you want to discuss? But it was still pretty high level. Here's our idea for annual. We've set aside over an hour for each caucus, but we essentially facilitated discussion using live polling, where we asked the caucuses a couple of key questions to facilitate discussion. For example, the Oregon legislature just prohibited single-family zoning in cities. So we could take that question and ask each caucus via live polling on your phone, would you support, be neutral, oppose the state eliminating single-family zoning? Then we would see what the feedback is based on the different caucuses. And maybe it's all universal. Or maybe the established mid-sized cities would say, actually, that doesn't bother us because we've implemented ADU ordinances, which basically gets to that anyway. Or the rapid growth cities would say, not in your life for these reasons. But we may be able to get a little different feedback from the different groups that's more nuanced. I was using that question as a draconian example, but we'd come up with 2 or 3 facilitated questions, whether they be on tax policy or land use, to see if we could get that additional feedback. Really, the ultimate question for you as a board is, how can collecting feedback from the caucuses help you govern the organization? And are you comfortable with this idea for September?
Sounds great to me, Cameron. What do you guys think?
I like the real-time responses aspect of it, because I think we get a lot of good things discussed, and either people don't want to talk, or it's just like we have public hearings sometimes and you wonder, people don't want to talk because they don't they don't know which side of the issue they're going to be on, filling the room out. So I think that's a good aspect to it.
And I would just say, if you're looking for real substantive information, I would follow up those with more of a comprehensive survey of the membership as a whole. Mm-hmm. If you're really looking for data that you can use, or that can be used for for any kind of decision, rather than just kind of the feel good on the spot questioning that helps facilitate discussion. If we're looking for data for this group, for instance, then I think a follow-up survey that tries to glean more responses, just so they're simply more representative, would be helpful.
Yeah, depends on the questions. Okay, I don't know what they all are. mean, I probably can predict some of them, but, throwing those out ahead of time, so it's not just a spur of the moment, doing that hour, but there's some thought given to it, or, you think more of the complicated, nuances and things like that. You may still want to get that boiled down to a position, I don't know, but I think if you have ideas about what kinds of issues we're going to need to make decisions about rolling them out ahead of time would be good.
Cameron, just one other thought. I know you pointed this out, but probably you won't have questions that are quite as draconian as the one you just mentioned.
Yeah, I use that as an example, but
I'm just saying the more realistic they are, I think the better the feedback's going to be.
So, for example, a question could say something like, would you support changes in the income tax in exchange for flexibility and truth in taxation? I mean,
Right.
we could put some actual concepts out there to generate discussion so that when you as a board next meet, we could say, here's the feedback we heard from the members about these potential trades, or something about the land use penalties, or something to solicit that further feedback.
Yep, perfect.
Which then leads to that last item, which we brought up earlier. It's been a session-like pace this summer. It's always hard to think about employee burnout in August on the legislative arena, but that's really where we've been at this summer. And so I'm concerned about it from a manager perspective. And so we're going to, as staff, try to dedicate some time over the next few weeks to reprioritize our efforts. Nicole, you mentioned doing a survey, but asking the membership to better prioritize for us what they care about. Last year we worked on 362 bills. Not every bill is created equal, but a city somewhere had a stake in one of those bills. And so the challenge that I have as a manager is to make sure that we are focusing on the best priorities for the organization while not burning out our staff. And then the conversation in a future board meeting is there a way to better prioritize where we're spending that legislative capital? And Mike, do you want to quickly share the interesting comment from Representative Gibson this morning about the kind of the league message when we're involved in every issue?
Yeah. Basically, in a nutshell, it's that when you're involved in every issue, the certain segments of legislators give us a salute, and it's not a very good salute, but it's with one finger sometimes. So,
right, we're number one.
Yeah, we're number one.
Are they saying we're watering down our influence by getting too involved?
a little bit by sometimes, yeah. If we're just going, and not that he had any any feelings or any sympathy for Cameron when he said we tracked 362 bills, and he said, well, I deal with thousands, and it's like, but just that the point of being strategic where you're at, which I think we did better last year than we did the year before.
Yeah, and I think the year before we were being tested and we had issues coming at us from all sides. It's easy hypothetically to say we need to pull back, but if we're trying to focus on principles and principles are being eroded, ultimately we have to push back to support those principles. But it's a conversation that I think is worth having at the board level and worth having as soon as possible as we go into the fall and prepare for the session.
Cameron, I just want to say I agree with that completely. In fact, I'd like the rest of the board members to know that I actually, in Cameron's review, I counseled him to be cautious about his time, because I can't imagine how he and Rachel and Susan and Abby and Nick and Wayne, everybody else. You get the point. I can't imagine how you all do it. And so I do think we need to be careful and make sure that as a board, we don't set unrealistic expectations that would cause burnout or for people to leave out of desperation to be able to have a quality of life. Here we are fighting for quality of life in our cities and towns. We need to make sure that our association, that this organization also models that. So I'd welcome that discussion, Cameron.
Well, between you, Mayor, and Mike, incoming president, I think this should be the focus of the meeting in October. I think doing it because the next board meeting will be during the annual convention, so I think that's asking a little too much of everybody, but doing it shortly after the convention. By then, we've gotten some feedback through the caucuses and other things, and we can have a good discussion about prioritizing our legislative efforts.
Well, and I'll speak maybe to the size of Spanish Fork City, getting up to 46,000 people now, of a city that maybe relied heavily on the league before. Of this is our whole lobbying effort, right? This is all the work you do at the Capitol for us, so we're not getting, there's a certain time, and I don't know if there's a magic number or what it is, but if you're growing up as a city, here's the certain things the league's going to focus on. Here's what their bandwidth is. If you have something else, you hire a lobbyist. There's lobbying firms out there, and something specific you do. And maybe that's a message that a city our size can help take to other emerging cities that way and say, here's what they have the bandwidth with, and if you need something else, be prepared to go out and spend money to do that for you.
It's articulating pillars of advocacy. So as a group, we're boom, 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 maybe. And then there's always going to be personalization. But again, that then funnels down to your responsibility as an elected official or as a city to advocate as you deem fit. But I think you have to get to that point of established pillars of advocacy, or you're just chasing your tail the entire time. And nobody's happy, frankly. Everybody's mad at you. So,
That's okay. We're good having people.
There's ways, to Mike's point, there's ways of setting expectations ahead of time to really be effective and efficient, but also require others to put skin in the game because it's their game.
And I want to applaud all of your cities that contribute staff and your time as elected officials as part of the League Army effort. Like, that's what makes us successful at the legislature. Is the strength of the League is the membership and the collective. It's just over the last few years, we're seeing more and more and more issues. And so the question is, what should the top priorities be? The tax task force, the perfect example, was out of our control. Legislature dropped it on us. It matters to everybody. It's huge. It has sucked an enormous amount of bandwidth. It's prevented us from working on other issues. And we have cities saying, why aren't you working on that issue? Well, because we're trying to keep your budgets whole. But helping define those expectations going into January, I think, will be really important. So that, Mayor, we're past 2:30, and I owe Susan an apology because we didn't get to the communication stuff. Do you want to take 2 minutes and just explain where we're at?
30 seconds.
Okay.
Let me pull up my slide. Okay, this was a toaster that it was animated. Unfortunately, you can't see it, but there's a little piece of toast popping out. I want to, just in case. Oh, now mine stopped working.
Who's doing it for us?
Yeah, we got the hand.
Communications efforts are going well. You can see that just on Facebook, for example, views are up, likes, reach, engagements, they're up in a substantial way. We're doing our bi-weekly podcast. We've had a lot of interesting subjects. We have more in the works, more planned. We're going to pop out during the annual. And then we're also working on the website and Gov Delivery, which is going to help with our outreach and making connections with organizations like ours throughout the nation. And so things are really great. We have some analytics from Granicus, which is our new web designer, but I don't think we have time to get into that. It was just, we're getting really great feedback back about who's using our site and what they're searching for. So this is going to help us as we long-term, we put all the pieces together to make a really user-friendly, functional website. Is that true?
Yeah, it's awesome. And the idea being that by next September, so Dr. Brenner, you'll have to come back and make sure you're there next September, but be able to, at the Salt Palace, new website, kind of here's the finishing of the reboot of the League.
I'm watching it every time I turn it. When I get this stuff up, it's not for my eyes only, for hours.
So then then the last thing on the training is we're negotiating with John Park, who's a retired city manager, to help us retool the elected officials essentials training after the November election. He's working on a survey that we'll send out. We want to send a survey, Nicole, both on the legislative priority side to the general membership, but also to administrators and others of like what training does the League not currently offer that you would like to see, or what trainings would you like to see enhanced, and as we look at other partnerships to improve that overall training. So yeah, a lot of work to do, but the staff is very dedicated. We're excited to do it, and it's been a busy summer, but it's been a productive one. So thank you for your support of us, and thank you for your participation in the league. And the next meeting per the officers will be during the annual convention, but instead of at the beginning of the week, we'll do a board dinner on the Thursday night of the conference. So we'll have a brief, potentially a business meeting if we have business to conduct. Otherwise, we'll go to a restaurant and just have a social gathering and a chance to say thank you for your service for those who are leading the board that Thursday evening.
For those of you that are looking at the schedule, it's September 12th, not September 13th.
Thursday, I thought Thursday, oh, yep, so Thursday is the 12th. Yep.
Oh, yes. Sorry about that.
Cameron, are spouses or significant others welcome to that Thursday evening dinner?
Yes.
Yes, so we will send out an updated calendar invite right after this meeting, just now that we've announced it. And I will include that information in there as well, along with the Zoom information. And very briefly, Cam wanted me to mention this, that this Friday is the deadline for board nominations. So we sent all that information to you in the June meeting. If your term is coming up and if you'd like to reapply, if you're interested in applying for the second vice position, or if you know other folks in your board areas that would like to apply for the board, let us know. And by Friday, we'll have all of our nominations in.
Well, thank you, Nick. Thanks, Cameron. Anything else that we need to cover quickly?
No, thank you for the 3 hours. Tried to pack a lot in there, but it was a good discussion.
All right. Well, then, I guess we ought to have, do we need a motion to adjourn, Cameron?
That was the most enthusiastic motion.
All right. Passes overwhelmingly. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, good luck to your wife.
Thanks. She's having an ultrasound as we speak.
Sure. Do you have your time? So, during the training pieces,
You drive up there?
Yeah.
I've got the
Board meeting
Yeah, and then
On the Thursday. That was
we don't have one on Tuesday the 10th.
I'll change that one that's on from Tuesday to 10th. That'll move to the 12th.
Okay.
So right when we close up here, I'll.
The 12th is Thursday.
12th, Thursday,
Okay.
Thursday the 12th is when we're going.
Cool.
Yep.
He's gonna move that date.